Those vocals there are sick, aren't they? Let's go. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Awesemo.com NBA Deeper Dive. 3-game slate, ton of injuries, ton of COVID protocol, and that's why you're here with us to break it all down over the next hour. And then another hour again with Chris Spags and Greg Ehrenberg for Live Before Lock. I'm Dave Loughran on Twitter at Loughy_D, LOUGHY_D, and with me, as always, the man, Adam Scherer, ShipMyMoney DFS. What's going on, brother?
Pretty crazy slate for 3 games today. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of moving pieces. I think it's kind of a good tournament slate too, because there's just a lot of guesswork to be done. So it's a situation where I think that you can make educated guesses, but everybody is kind of guessing. So it's going to be a little bit more volatile, I think, than most NBA slates.
Yep, and the Trae Young news is pretty huge. We already have the Clippers news. We already knew that Washington is going to be down a significant amount of players once again for COVID protocols. Christian Wood is doubtful to play. Reggie Bullock's really the only big news from that late game, which was on its face already the least appealing. But dude, these first 2 games, and you've got some marquee players that not only would go down, a lot of times, Adam, you get spots where like a player is inactive and then you go, well, I guess you could play him. He's a decent value. He's okay. I'll get a little bit of him. But if Trae Young goes down, you get a $4,200 Rondo. And then assuming Christian Wood is out, doubtful now, you get a $6,000 DeMarcus Cousins who just stuffs the stat sheet on every given occasion. Those are 2 spots right there that are going to be massive chalk and for really good reason.
Yeah, and the other thing too is when I first sat down to write the deep dive article earlier, I already knew that Kawhi was out, I knew George was out, and I knew that Wood was doubtful. And so my first thought coming in was, oh man, there's gonna be so much value on this slate. It's just gonna be a matter of rotating through them. But both sites, DraftKings and FanDuel, did a really good job, especially DraftKings, FanDuel to a lesser extent, but still a pretty good job of pricing up guys on the Clippers. So you still have value there, but you don't have the glaring value like Rajon Rondo will be if Trae Young is out. So it makes that news that we're waiting on from the Hawks even more important, because it's not like you can just say, oh, well, if Trae Young plays, I'm going to just roster, 3K Reggie Jackson from the Clippers, because that's not an option.
You ready to dive into this?
Yep.
3 games, but it'll take us the hour, I think.
It always does.
What's that?
I said it always does.
Yeah, well, it has to anyway, right? We don't have much of a choice on this one. LA Clippers at the Atlanta Hawks. The Clippers coming into this one on the road without Kawhi Leonard, without Paul George. Jordan, do me a favor, change that to 5. I think I gave you a stale line, or not, and one that wasn't updated. I gave you the opening line. Change that to 5. They're 5-point dogs. Thank you. With a 221.5 point total. So 5-point dogs, 221.5 point total. The Clippers implied total on this slate is 108.25. Believe it or not, the second lowest of any team on this 3-gamer. The big question here, and this is where I want to start it off with, is what do you anticipate the starting lineup be? And then we can work backwards from there.
So my guess at the starting lineup is Reggie Jackson, Kennard, Batum, Morris, and Ibaka. It wouldn't be shocking if Lou Williams started in place of one of the 3 guys that doesn't normally start. But my guess is that he comes off the bench. It's tough. It's tough to be too confident in it, because we haven't had a game this year where both George and Kawhi were out, but we also haven't even had a game where either of them were out and Marcus Morris was active. So I'm guessing Morris replaces one of them. Luke Kennard's been the replacement for the other, for the whenever they've sat so far this year. So I'm guessing he starts. But again, Lou Williams, if he started, it wouldn't be the most surprising thing.
Eric says, you guys absolutely will find a way to take it to the wire. Yep, sure will. Hopefully you're entertained along the way and there's some decent information in the process. The thing with Lou Williams is you've seen his minutes decline for sure this season. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, this is someone that had a monster usage rate last year without Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on the floor, right? And I think if you were to get 25 minutes from a healthy Lou Williams today against Atlanta, it feels like this is a spot where if ownership is coming in low, and earlier today we were getting Trae Young ownership at like, Lou Williams ownership at like 20%. I'm willing to take some shots there for sure, because he's still someone that is going to be one of the primary playmakers. And if he comes off the bench, assuming it's a competitive game, there's really nobody else in the bench unit, the second unit, that's going to be seeing a ton of volume. We can talk about Serge Ibaka in a minute as a starter. And I know that Montrezl Harrell and Lou Williams had that synergy over the past couple of years. But what are you doing with Lou Williams, given his price point being $1,000 less than Reggie Jackson on DraftKings?
So I think, and I kind of mentioned it at the top, that we're just making educated guesses here. And I think it sets up for a lot of times on NBA slates in particular compared to other sports, because the NBA is more projectable and more predictable. A lot of times there's a lot more like, oh, well, this guy's popular, but there's no real way around it. I do think ownership plays a little bit bigger role on this slate just because of the uncertainty. With Lou Williams, not only do you have uncertainty around exactly how many minutes he ends up playing, but there's at least some uncertainty around what player is Lou Williams at this point. Like if you go back and look at his numbers since the start of last season without Paul George and Kawhi on the floor, he's got a 35% usage rate. He's averaged 1.33 DraftKings points per minute. He's only played 30 minutes without them on the floor this year, only a 24% usage rate. He's averaged 0.88 DraftKings points per minute. Obviously we're only talking 30 minutes there, but you put that, you keep in mind that he's just been bad this year anyway. And it's a little bit scarier to get to him than it would be last year. But that being said, I think especially if the ownership is relatively low, as you were saying, then I'm willing to take a chance there, because outside of what is still a small sample this year, and especially a small sample without them on the floor, Lou Williams is a scorer. He has been his whole career. He's been consistent. He's always been someone that can light it up. And so I think that the assumption should still be that without those high usage guys on the floor, that Lou Williams is going to be a good scorer, even though he really hasn't shown that this year.
We don't have him projected in the top 15 right now, as far as ownership goes. The Hawks are playing at, tied for a top 10 pace in the league. And while their defense has been a little bit better this season, they're still really not all that intimidating. So, lower ownership on Lou Will on a 3-game slate to me just seems to make sense. I think all of your points are valid. Like, has he been the same player? No. Are the minutes the same? No. Does having Tyronn Lue and not Doc Rivers there make a difference? It certainly seems to be the case to some extent. But I guess the question too, Adam, would be, we know that Williams and we know that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George had a lot of staggered minutes, which is the reason that despite Lou Will coming off the bench is why he only played 30 minutes total with both of them off the floor this season. What do you think, though, outside of Lou Williams on the bench unit? I know they'll stagger again, but there are going to be opportunities where Lou Will is the gunner, where he's the guy, the ball handler, the playmaker, and the scorer.
Yeah, that's what I keep coming back to too. Like, he has to be, right?
Right. I don't know who else it would be.
Right. If Lou Williams isn't out there taking shots, is Terrence Mann taking them? It's not like he's a high usage guy.
Right.
Zubats is whatever, but he's not handling the ball. He's not creating for himself. If it's not Lou Williams, I don't know who it is. And so that's what I keep coming back to, and why I'm willing to take a chance on him there, even though I'm definitely more concerned about him than I would be if we were in the same situation last year.
And he still has a 23% usage rate this season, which isn't terrible. His assist rate's down. Maybe Montrezl Harrell's absence has something to do with that. But it's a decision you have to make for yourself. If you're all right, I think you'd agree. If you're okay taking on risk, but having the upside with low ownership in large field tournaments on such a small slate, Lou Williams just makes sense. If you're trying to play it safe, maybe you're getting away from him and you want to go and say, hey, I like Luke Kennard's minutes at $6,000. What are your thoughts on him and Marcus Morris, who's really one of the better values on this slate, and ownership dictates that right now as the second highest projected owned player overall?
Yeah, I think Morris is the clear best value. He's like the only guy on DraftKings that didn't really get priced up. And on FanDuel, he's 5K as well. There's a couple other really good values on FanDuel, but Morris really stands out as the spot where I think I feel the most comfortable. Like I'm fine getting the Reggie Jackson, especially with it being a 3-game slate, but he is 6,800. It's really easy for Reggie Jackson to fail at $6,800, regardless of who he's playing with. I still think it's a good matchup. I think he gets enough minutes that he at least has an opportunity to have success, but he's priced, pretty appropriately. I think Morris is pretty clearly underpriced. Batum and Kennard both, I think, play enough minutes that they have a chance to do well at their salaries. What I keep the other thing too is, outside of Williams, outside of to some extent Jackson and Ibaka, who is taking shots here? Because like Nick Batum isn't the type of guy that you expect to go out there and have a really high usage rate, and really neither is Kennard. But I really don't know who's shooting outside of those three guys. So I think you have to see maybe an inefficient bump, but still a bump for these guys. So I think they at least have opportunities, but they are priced more to their medium projections, maybe even a little bit overpriced for their medium projections. Reggie Jackson, 5K on FanDuel, much different story. I think, a much better value there. I'm really interested in Ibaka. He's a power forward on FanDuel, which is really nice, but center is not a really big issue on this slate either. Obviously we may or may not have Capela. You have Cousins. You don't have a whole lot to love from Washington. You don't have much to love from the Knicks, and then you have Rudy Gobert, who's fine. So you don't have any of those really top center options. So the opportunity cost isn't as high. Ibaka last year averaged well over a fantasy point per minute when he played without Kyle Lowry or Pascal Siakam, which I think is like the most relevant comparison you can make from that Raptors team to this Clippers team. He's someone that's capable of scoring. He's a good per minute producer. It's also, I think, less likely that the Clippers close with a small lineup tonight, since they are missing two of their starting wings and their starting point guard. I think there's a better chance that you get Ibaka closing or Zubac's closing, but most likely Ibaka, especially if Capela's in. So I think maybe a couple more minutes for Ibaka and more usage, more opportunities across the board. So I do feel pretty good about Ibaka here.
All right. Tizo says, "Hey Laffy, is that an Awesemo fitted? That's tough. It's an Awesemo snapback, as a matter of fact, but they have them in fitteds. I think they're going to be available tomorrow. Pretty sick though, right? I like it. Just the logo, not the writing. Looks nice, smooth. Someone says you can take the sticker off. Be honest, dude, I got it today. Totally forgot the sticker was still on there.
I wore the dirtiest hat that I own in hopes that someone will just send me one of the Awesemo hats.
Oh, there's no doubt that your hat has already been mentioned a couple times. Someone said Adam's hat looks like my socks when I've been left home alone. Someone else said, Adam, that hat's been through a lot of DFS sweats. So the sock one gets, if I was giving out free subs, that would just get a 3-year subscription, because that was the best. Do you remember the day where everyone railed on Josh's hair for like a straight hour? Were you there for that?
I'm not sure if I remember that. I vaguely remember that. I definitely remember his mustache.
I couldn't even do the show. I couldn't do the show. I was laughing so hard. It was the greatest thing ever. Just got destroyed. He's watching. I know he is. Do you think there's a non-zero chance Lou Williams gets isolated, doesn't play because he's back home in his hometown of Atlanta and breaks COVID protocol?
I hadn't thought about it till you just mentioned it, but there are some good wings in Atlanta.
Yes, there are. Let's talk about Serge Ibaka, right? He's another guy where it's funny. You normally you'd look at it and be like, well, you can't use him as a proxy for Montrezl Harrell. But what if I told you that last year in like 700 minutes that Harrell played without Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, that he had a 31% usage rate? So Ibaka is the type of guy we saw in Toronto that got ample usage when some of those top players were out. And that happened quite often last year, at least for a decent stretch. I think you could be looking at another huge game from Ibaka here. He's another one who, like Morris, high owned, Luke Kennard getting a lot of ownership. There's a couple guys on this team, they're getting a lot of ownership. Serge Ibaka, meanwhile, and maybe you have something to say against this, but 8.6% projected ownership on Serge Ibaka. What does that say to you? Is he still too expensive, or is his exceedingly high usage in spots like this enough for you to get there?
That's kind of the thing is I think he's priced more or less where he should be. Like there's still upside for him at that salary, but he's at a point where he can still fail. And that would be more of a concern for me if the center position were deeper, or that wasn't the case with almost the entire Clippers team. And if the questionable players are in for Atlanta, outside of some pretty questionable talent on Washington, there's not a whole lot of value that you're going to feel really good about on this slate. So it makes it so that you can afford to take risks a little bit on someone like Ibaka. You mentioned Harrell's rates last year without George and without Leonard. I got the numbers for Ibaka when he was on Toronto: 227 minutes without Kyle Lowry or Pascal Siakam on the floor, 1.14 DraftKings points per minute, 25.4% usage rate. He's got to take a step forward offensively here. And, as I mentioned before, I think there's a better chance that he gets those closing minutes as well, because it's less likely that Marcus Morris gets time closing at center, since it would just really thin out the wings there. So I like Ibaka here. I think that especially if the ownership's that low, it's a high upside spot to get to in tournaments.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, 8.6% on a 3-gamer. If he comes in anywhere around that, I think there's some serious appeal. What did you say? I'm sorry. What did you say his rates are last year without Siakam and was it Lowry?
Yeah, without Siakam and Lowry, 25.4% usage rate, 13.1% assist percentage, 13.2% rebounding percentage, 1.14 DraftKings points per minute.
That's not bad. And that's still with Van Vliet out there. I mean, would you be surprised at all if Ibaka's the highest usage Clipper today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like you would assume, I think that it's Lou, but or Jackson, but it could definitely be Ibaka. I mean, the thing is though, you can't really expect with much confidence that Ibaka plays more than like 26 to 28 minutes. He definitely could, but that's what makes him still really risky, I think, is if let's say you take 1.15 fantasy points per minute as an average and give him 28 minutes, he's still disappointing at his DraftKings salary. So that's where the risk is. But it goes back to my point before of it's not like there's a bunch of options from this Clippers team, especially on DraftKings, where there's not that same risk.
Right. So top options from the Clippers before we talk the other side of this one in the Hawks. You have Marcus Morris discounted, but he's going to be popular, rightfully so. Luke Kennard, 6K on DraftKings is going to be pretty popular. Again, you mentioned earlier that the price discrepancy from DraftKings to FanDuel is pretty significant. So don't be building the lineup on DraftKings or FanDuel and trying to do something very similar on DraftKings. It's not going to look the same. Lou Williams, who's cheap with pretty low ownership, and then Serge Ibaka at 6,600 on DraftKings, whose ownership is in the single digits right now. What are your top options here?
So this was when I write the deep dive, I try and list the top options from each team, and it was really hard for me to do the Clippers today.
Totally free at awesemo.com, by the way. Phenomenal article. Check that out every single day of the week.
It was just really difficult to do today because so many of these guys, I think, are in the same situation where like they're overpriced for their average projection, but there's also a really good chance one or two of these guys step up and have a big game. So the way that I'm approaching it is I prefer the guys that are going to handle the ball and have the potential to be high usage. So that would give us Reggie Jackson, Ibaka, and Williams. I think Marcus Morris is the most favorably priced. So I would say he's the number one option. And then really in situations like this in tournaments, a lot comes down to ownership. Like I think Luke Kennard is fine at 6K. I think he plays more. I think he plays over 30 minutes. He's been productive in his limited time without those guys on the floor this year. But I also don't think that there's any reason that right now Luke Kennard is 30% owned, Nick Batum is 11% owned, and Reggie Jackson is 7% owned. I think those guys all have more or less the same range of outcomes, very similar projections, very similar everything. So I don't really know why there's this ownership discrepancy. And I'm not saying I don't like Luke Kennard, but I am saying if he's 3 times as owned as Nick Batum and 5 times as owned as Reggie Jackson, I like those guys more in tournaments.
No doubt. So do I. And I think we covered the Clippers pretty well here. On to the Atlanta Hawks. Trae Young, I've been trying to pay very close attention for injury news here. He's questionable. He missed last game. And I mentioned on today's strategy show, Adam, with Alex, that he was just starting to heat up. The 3-pointers were beginning to drop again. Someone took exception this morning with me saying that Trae Young is not a particularly good 3-point shooter. Like he's not elite. He's fine, but he's not an elite 3-point shooter. He just shoots a lot of them. And that's exactly what I want to see. But is Young in?
Yep, Young's in, Capela's in, Gallinari's in.
Oh, see, you know what? Sometimes it just works out for us.
Anyway, imagine paying $2,000 for a highlight of a guy that's not even a good 3-point shooter.
It was a bargain, dude. That was why do I care? It was a highlight of an assist. All right.
Cam Reddish ruled out.
Imagine paying 888 and 750 for a guy that's not even active. So Cam Reddish is out, which is weird because he was probable earlier in the day. Danilo Gallinari is in. Clint Capela is in. Trae Young is in. I had so many people sending me lineups today with Rondo in. Now that, that chops everything up, you're going to have to make some adjustments. But here's the thing, Adam. It's not like, I can't play Rondo now. Trae Young's 9,100 against the Clippers team who was without their best on-ball guard defender and Patrick Beverley, without Kawhi Leonard and without Paul George. This defense, already middle of the road this season, could look like absolute dog shit tonight. And Trae Young is at his cheapest price point in a little while.
Yeah, I think, and he's really expensive on FanDuel. Him and Capela are both over 10K on FanDuel. They're 9,100 and 9,400 on DraftKings. So one kind of note before we even get into that, and I had mentioned it when we talked about the Clippers, but Young and Capela being in makes those Clippers plays that we were kind of like, yeah, they're okay. It makes them look relatively better because you just lost Rajon Rondo. You just lost some of this other value. But as far as Young goes, I think obviously his ceiling makes it so he's a tournament. He's in play in tournaments no matter what his salary is pretty much. But 9,100 on DraftKings, I think is a pretty good price point. You have just kind of looking, further across the slate, you have Bradley Beal up here at 9,900, who I absolutely love and we'll talk about. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot that I'm super excited about at the top tier, especially at guard. So I do think that the Clippers should have trouble here. You're missing George, you're missing Kawhi, and you're missing Patrick Beverley. That's one way to make a defense really bad, really quick. And you're replacing those guys with Reggie Jackson, Luke Kennard, Lou Williams. It's probably not going to be a fun experience for the Clippers defensively. Young, assuming he's healthy, assuming he's playing his normal 34 plus minutes in a competitive game, I think looks really, really good here. He's not been great this year. He's been kind of disappointing this year by his standards compared to what we saw last year, but he's still averaging over 1.3 DraftKings points per minute. He's still got a usage rate over 30%, still gets a ton of assists. So I do still really, really like Trae Young here.
I do too. I think 9,100 is just too cheap. You're not always going to get spectacular games from him, but and it was something you had mentioned before. A couple of those really awful games were in matchups where these teams did a great job of limiting the pick and roll and just gave him a lot of trouble. But his last four have looked much better. He's pretty much in most spots an instant points, assist, a double-double, which helps you out on DraftKings quite a bit. And the shot volume recently has been way up, 22 plus attempts in 3 of his last 4. So I'm on board for sure. What about the rest? We'll get to Capela in a minute and the ridiculous shot blocking acumen that we've seen from him. But what about the rest of these guys, non-Trae Young? Are we looking at any of them today?
So I think that with Reddish being out, it helps to solidify minutes most likely for Kevin Huerter and DeAndre Hunter. They're both priced about where they should be, I think. Hunter's averaged 0.94 DraftKings points per minute this year. Huerter's at 0.84. He's a little bit cheaper. I think you can probably get like 35, 36 minutes from Hunter, 32 to 34 from Huerter. So they're both decent kind of like last guy in type plays, I think. I feel pretty similarly about John Collins. I was going to love him if Clint Capela was out because you were going to get the bulk of his minutes at center where he's averaged about 1.25 fantasy points per minute since last year. But with Capela in, you're going to get very few minutes at center most likely, assuming that Okongwu stays in the rotation. You're not going to get that many minutes for Collins. So he's still a good enough player where at 7,600 he can have a good game. But I think the probability of that happening goes down quite a bit with most of his minutes coming at the 4 as opposed to the 5.
So Clint Capela is coming off some absolutely monstrous games. I never thought that he'd be priced upwards of 9,400. But that's what happens when you're ripping off huge performances with huge block totals, 26 rebounds and 5 blocks just 2 games ago against Detroit. And you're beginning to see, this type of emergence of Clint Capela that we absolutely never saw in Houston. And remember, he was injured for a lot of last season and they didn't play in the bubble. So 19% usage this season, 25% total rebound rate, 25%, monstrous 34% defensive rebound rate, and a block rate almost at 7%. I mean, 2 of those numbers are outright elite through his first 13 games.
Yeah, I think he's pretty clearly overpriced for his median projection. The one thing that I'll say here, and this applies to Russell Westbrook, who we'll talk about later too, it's a 3-game slate with a limited number of players who are even capable of scoring 55 plus fantasy points. So in tournaments, especially large field tournaments, there is still some merit as long as his ownership stays as low as we have it projected right now. We have him between 3 and 4%. Getting a player with that kind of upside on a 3-game slate just naturally, it inherently has some value in large field tournaments. That being said, he's as much as I love Clint Capela, and I've been pretty high on him for these big games, I think the price tag went a little bit overboard here. He's been playing huge minutes, which is great to see, but you do have this Hawks team getting healthier. You have a Okongwu back in the rotation. You have Gallinari back, playing probably 18 to 20 minutes. There's just more front court bodies available. So with the price tag rising, even if you go from 38 or 39 minutes down to 35 or 36, that's going to make a pretty big deal. I don't expect the block rate to be as high as it has been over the last few games. I don't think you're getting many more triple doubles with blocks from Clint Capela. Yep. Even though he will get some blocks. So that's where I'm concerned. On the other side, the things that I think are actually sustainable is that his per minute production is up this year. His rebounding percentage is up to 24% from 21% last year. That I think is actually sustainable. If you look at his playing time last year when Russell Westbrook was not on the floor, he had a 24% rebounding percentage. This year he's at 24.3%. His usage rate this year is at 19.9% compared to about 16.5% last year. Trae Young, not quite James Harden level usage, not playing again with Russell Westbrook. So I think those things actually could stay. And I do think that you see Capela continue to produce at a higher rate than last year. I think he still has a monster ceiling, but clearly from a medium projection standpoint, he's overpriced. And you're basically, if you roster him in tournaments, you're just rostering him because nobody else wants to. And clearly he's capable at least of giving you a tournament winning score.
Sure. Yeah, I was looking at the putback frequency and possessions. Him and Drummond are basically tied atop the league, which is good to get you some easy buckets. But only a couple possessions as the roll man and pick and rolls this year. There's just unfortunately not a ton here as a big man that's going to command the ball. Like he's not going to post up. You're not going to see any of that stuff. So I also worry that while he's really active around the rim and that's how his bread is buttered, there are going to be a lot of games where those scoring totals dip quite a bit because you're just not running plays for Clint Capela. You're not using him in the pick and roll. You're not posting him up. He's getting, cleaning up around the rim, and that's valuable in its own right. But 9,400, I can see why he's 3% owned.
Yeah, like it's a weird situation to talk about, and it really only comes into play on these smaller slates because, like, if this were yesterday where you had 10 games or whatever it was, it would be like we talked about with James Harden and Kevin Durant, where it's like, yeah, he could have a really big game, but there's other low-owned guys that can have big games and are more likely to do so. On a 3-game slate, you don't really have those other guys. It's kind of like you roster the same expensive players that everyone else is, or you overpay for someone like Capela. So that's why I think it's at least worth talking about, like the opportunity to just get a really low-owned guy in tournaments that is capable of posting a monster game, but it's really solely just if he's actually this low-owned.
Anything else for the Hawks or the Clippers?
Not really. Young being in and Capela being in really took a lot of the value off of the Atlanta side.
Yeah, it certainly makes Trae Young really appealing, though. I'm liking that a lot at that current price point. Seeing if we have any news. I do not believe we have any updated news, so we keep moving forward. I think I forgot to mention it earlier in the show, but guys, hit that thumbs up if you haven't done so yet, and girls, if you haven't done so, and subscribe to the channel. We have moved up almost another 100 since yesterday, Adam. 49,400 subs, 600 to go, a little under 2 weeks to hit our mark of 50K by the Super Bowl. Thanks to all of you. You guys have been awesome in supporting us since I've been at Awesemo for the past couple of years, since Adam and all of us came over from FanVice. It's been pretty incredible seeing this grow and being able to put out what we think is some great free content here on the site. So if you appreciate it and you think along the way we've helped you out, hit that thumbs up and the subscribe button. We keep it moving with Washington and Houston. The Wizards now are, what do we got? 3.5-point dogs. 233 total though, Adam. Monster total. Houston has a slate high 118.25 implied total. The Wizards are second at 114.75. I mean, this game just on all fronts profiles as an absolute shootout. And you need not look any further than the Wizards' 29th defensive rating in the league. The fact that they're playing basically one full additional possession per 48 than any other team in the league, 105.7 possessions per 48. It's just a game that really profiles as a fantasy dream. And now that's why DeMarcus Cousins is going to be as popular as he is. But let's start with the COVID-ravaged Washington Wizards in the backcourt with Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal.
We just got the Clippers starting lineup. Do you want to do that now or after?
Let's do it now.
All right. Terrence Mann, Reggie Jackson, Kennard, Nick Batum, Ibaka. So Marcus Morris not starting, Lou Williams not starting. I still think the salary on Morris is good. I would expect there's a good chance he's in the closing lineup. I think the biggest thing is that it just helps to solidify minutes for Terrence Mann, who's the minimum salary on FanDuel and who's 4,200 on DraftKings, I believe, 4,400. He's not a great fantasy producer, but given that we just lost Rajon Rondo value, if you can expect, like, let's say 26 to 28 minutes from Terrence Mann, I think it's a decent value at 4,400. I would be cognizant of where the ownership comes in, though. Like, this isn't the kind of guy where if he's 75% owned or something, that there's no way he fails. But I do think he projects as a good value now.
My God, chat is losing their minds over Terrence Mann. That'll be one to monitor throughout the night.
Yeah, I mean, so since I'm pulling it up now to see what his rates were, I looked it up earlier for the article. I think he's like 0.77 DraftKings points per minute without George or Kawhi since last year. Granted, he's still playing with Reggie Jackson, still playing with Serge Ibaka, so a couple of higher usage guys out there. But I think he's a good point per dollar value now. It's just a matter of, how popular is he going to be?
Sure. His price was preemptively jacked up on DraftKings too, by the way. So you're not getting him at minimum salary. I'm not surprised Lou Williams isn't starting though. Like, if Lou Williams didn't start, what are you going to do with your bench? Like, your bench is just going to be disastrous. And I doubt Tyronn Lue wants to run his starters for 40 minutes in a regular season game.
Right. Yeah. I'm more surprised Morris isn't starting than
Me too.
Williams.
Yeah. I thought he would be starting, but he's not. So
I think it's good for his usage though. I mean, I don't think, it makes you a little bit more skeptical of his minutes, I guess, but I still think Morris is a good value even off the bench.
You're going to see some Lou Will, Marcus Morris pick and roll at him.
With Zubats just standing there like,
yeah. Let's talk about Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal. Russell Westbrook returned to action last time out. Mind you, the Wizards hadn't played in a while, but he had missed a game or two prior to them being off with all those postponed games. Only 25 minutes, but that was also a blowout. He lost a few minutes towards the end, about 3 or so. I got him up over 30. I don't think Brooks is going to continue to limit him a ton. And then Bradley Beal, even with Westbrook on the floor this year, has been remarkable, and his usage hasn't taken much of a hit.
Yeah, Westbrook, I think, is one of the bigger question marks here because Brooks had said coming into that last game that he was going to limit him to around 25 minutes. He played 25 and a half, but anyone who's followed Scott Brooks and the Wizards for a while and played DFS knows that his minutes limits typically, especially on his star players, typically aren't really that strict. And you mentioned it that Westbrook, it looks like, could have played a couple more minutes at the end of that game had it been competitive. So I think the best guess tonight's probably 30 to 32 minutes from Westbrook, which makes it really difficult to prioritize him over either Bradley Beal or Trae Young. But there is at least that potential, especially if we don't get word that there's that potential that he plays a few more minutes than we're expecting. The big thing that concerns me right now, though, is we have 20% ownership projected to go to Westbrook. Right now, we actually have Trae Young getting less ownership. So if that's the case, I would rather go to Young, I think. But if we do get an ownership update and Young surpasses Westbrook, Westbrook starts to, get some appeal. But the spot that I'm really interested is Bradley Beal, who has just been excellent this year without Westbrook. It hasn't really mattered. Even in games that Westbrook has played, in 8 games with Westbrook, Beal has a 38% usage rate. He's averaging over 1.4 DraftKings points per minute. He's, playing in the game with the highest total on the slate by a pretty wide margin. Good spot here. He's averaging over 36 minutes per game in the games with Westbrook. I love Beal. He's one of my favorite plays on the entire slate. Any minutes that Westbrook doesn't play makes it even better for Beal. But even if you were getting full run from Westbrook, I think that Beal looks great.
Now, you're loving the fact that Westbrook is in a revenge game, right?
Yeah, him and John Wall are going to both just run right through their minutes limits and play 40.
Just as a refresher for anyone that's maybe taking a little time off here, Mo Wagner, Davis Bertans, Rui Hachimura, Avdia, Brown, and Smith are all out for Washington for COVID-19 protocols. Is that going to open things up more for us today? Of course, we talked about Russell Westbrook potentially getting limited a little bit in that last game. The starters that you saw in that one were Robin Lopez, Isaac Bonga, Russell Westbrook, Jerome Robinson, Bradley Beal. Robinson played 35 minutes. Russell Westbrook, again, 25, lost about 3 or 4 at the end. Bonga played 33, and he did close that game out, the only starter to close the game out. And Robin Lopez played 24. Now, Robin Lopez and Alex Len, now that Thomas Bryant is out, played almost all of the center minutes. The only reason they didn't play all 48 was because Jordan Bell got 4 of them in mop-up duties. So what do you see the rest of this rotation playing out like, and is there any potential value here?
Yeah, I think that especially with us losing the Atlanta value, Washington kind of becomes the team that has a lot of it. We are still waiting. Howell Neto is questionable. If he comes back, I expect that he takes the minutes that Cassius Winston played last game and then potentially takes a couple minutes off of some combination of Bonga, Jerome Robinson, Garrison Matthews. But I still think we'll have value here. You know, starting in the front court, Alex Len's only 3,300 on DraftKings, where you can roster 2 centers. It's not really palatable on FanDuel so much because that would cost you DeMarcus Cousins. But on DraftKings, you're getting a $3,300 Len, played almost 21 minutes in his first game with Washington. For his career, he's averaged just shy of 1 fantasy point per minute. So on a slate where the opportunity cost to center isn't quite as high, I think that using Len as a value play makes a lot of sense here. Robin Lopez has averaged 25 minutes per game in his couple of starts this year. He's more expensive. He's an okay value too, just not to the extent that Len is, I don't think. But then as far as, guards and forwards, you have Jerome Robinson and Garrison Matthews, who both played north of 32 minutes last game. Robinson started, Matthews came off the bench. Both guys were in towards the end. Matthews picked up a couple minutes in mop-up duty, but still was at 32 or 33. If Neto's out, I think you get similar run from those guys. If he's in, I think maybe they lose a couple minutes. But at the same time, with this version of the Wizards, those guys are going to be needed to be secondary scorers. As crazy as it sounds, behind Beal and behind Westbrook, Jerome Robinson and Garrison Matthews are the scorers on this team. So, I think that they're still cheap enough. They'll have enough opportunities here that they're still reasonable values in the context of the slate. Isaac Bonga, less so just because he's not as productive a player, should play 30 plus minutes, but isn't going to score or is unlikely to score at the same rates as guys like Robinson or Garrison Matthews.
Got a super chat coming in from Joe Sherman. Thanks, Joe. He says, thoughts on Cassius Winston? Didn't look bad last game. Any thoughts, Adam?
So it a lot depends on Neto. If Neto plays, I expect that Winston's a DNP. If Neto's out, I think that you could get 18 to 22 minutes from Winston. He's Cassius Winston. Like I don't even know what to expect from him. He's played like less than 100 minutes, this year. But he is 3,200 on a slate.
24 to be exact.
What'd you say?
24 minutes.
24, right. Exact. Yeah, he's like 0.83 fantasy points per minute over his 24 minutes. So the big thing is that he's $3,200, and like even Terrence Mann on DraftKings is $1,200 more. So there's definitely builds where plugging him in tournaments and just hoping for the best because of what else it'll get you makes sense. But really it depends on Neto's status.
Any other thoughts on Washington?
Nope, I think that's about it.
So the Houston side gets really interesting because DeMarcus Cousins is going to be mega chalk, and for a very good reason. He can fill up a stat sheet in pretty much any area. And I know that John Wall is back and Oladipo will be on the floor today. All of that is not lost on me, but it doesn't really concern me all that much. I mean, you're talking about a player in DeMarcus Cousins, and we don't even need to spend a ton of time on him, that 2 games ago, shot miserably, absolutely dreadful shooting, 2 for 16, and still had 36 DraftKings points. Played 33 and 30 minutes. They won both of those games without Christian Wood. And as you and I both pointed out, assuming that you continue to see Scott Brooks do the same thing with a big center rotation between Alex Len and Robin Lopez, it's very tough to believe that this is a Rockets team that's going to go small today. So when I look at DeMarcus Cousins and I see on the season a 27% usage rate, 23% assist rate, 24% rebound rate, and 4.5% block rate, I don't care if Oladipo and John Wall are playing together. He's going to get his, and he's going to have every opportunity to do it, especially if you get 30 minutes out of him.
Yeah, I mean, like the only potential concern that I have for Cousins would be that the Rockets are getting healthier. They should have Daniel House back. And so if they don't want to play him a bunch of minutes, they could, cut it back to like mid-20s and have PJ Tucker play more center, have House play more minutes. But the fact that he played more than 30 and just about 30 in a back-to-back makes me think that he's in shape. They're not worried about his minutes or anything like that. And even if you give him like 27 or 28 minutes with the way he's produced this year, he still looks really good. Then you consider that it's a Washington team that plays at a really fast pace, doesn't play defense. And I still just think that he's one of the best plays on the slate. Again, it would be different maybe if this were a slate where he's costing you Embiid or Vooch or Jokic or something like that, but he's not. If you get rid of Cousins, you're just losing one of the highest upside mid-range plays on the slate. And, I get that there's some merit to just not playing a 75% owned guy on a 3-game slate. Hope he somehow has a Dwight Howard type game and you just pass everybody. But it's just really, really tough to do on this slate, I think, especially in the matchup. So I'll be going back to Cousins. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But I think that there's still a lot more upside than downside at this price point.
Yeah, maybe there's foul trouble. Maybe he gets ejected. To your point, sure, there's always some merit to at least exploring the idea of fading him or coming in underweight. But the problem I have, Adam, again, not to belabor the point though, is 1.4 fantasy points per minute this season. And all of his rates, like this guy could shoot poorly and still have 19 rebounds, 7 assists, 3 steals, and 2 blocks. Like there are just so many ways that not having Cousins can hurt you. There are only a couple ways that having Cousins can hurt you, and one of them might be an ejection, but I'm not projecting for that. One of them might be foul trouble, but that could happen with anyone. So there are just so many more avenues that DeMarcus Cousins can have a good game, even if he doesn't play particularly well, than having a game that hurts you at this price point. So
yeah, that's the thing you mentioned, and I think it's really important. You can look at someone having a bad game and say, like Cousin hasn't been great from an actual basketball standpoint, but you look at the game he had against Detroit where he played 33 minutes. He had 36 DraftKings points. He shot 12.5% from the field and scored 36 DraftKings points. Like, yeah, you can look at that and say, yeah, he's not very good, but you can also look at that and say he had absolutely a floor game from a scoring standpoint and still 6x'd what his current salary is. So, yeah, it's kind of, there's more downside at his salary now than there was when he was, 4K, but it's still just really tough to get away from, especially when you consider like you need people in this price range. So if you're not playing Cousins, what are you doing and why is it better? You're playing like Serge Ibaka, who has the same minutes issues that you'd have with Cousins, or you're playing Reggie Jackson, who has the same minutes issues and doesn't produce at nearly the same per minute rate. Like there's just nothing comparable as far as ceiling goes in this price range.
Yep, and that's what I keep coming back to. So I think we've covered DeMarcus Cousins pretty well here. I don't know if we're going to need 15 minutes for this New York Knicks-Utah game, so let's spend a little bit more time on Houston. We'll go to John Wall. It's a revenge game, baby. Big one. I'm sure he's devastated that he's no longer in Washington, but ultimately, the matchup itself, like narrative aside, Adam, I mentioned a moment ago, fastest paced team in the league, second to worst defensive rating in the league. That is the Washington Wizards. I know they've dealt with myriad injuries this year and COVID protocol absences, but I mean, the biggest question is, what are you thinking for John Wall's minutes? I have him between 28 and 30, but that's a guess. I think he could get to 30, but I don't know how Silas is going to work this rotation tonight.
I think that's the big question. And the first thing that stands out to me is that we have John Wall projected for the second highest ownership on DraftKings at 63%. For a guy
he jumped Marcus Morris since the last update. Wow.
Yeah. So for someone that played 20 minutes last game in his first game back from injury, only played 12 first half minutes, I don't know how many minutes he plays. My guess is same as yours, 28 to 30. We had seen Steven Silas be aggressive with him in the preseason and early on in the regular season, which actually had made me pretty confident in him last game, which I ended up being completely wrong. And like I said, he played 20 minutes. But if there's a possibility, even which there is, that you get 25 minutes from John Wall at 63% owned, like I want no part of that. But at the same time, he has the potential to just be one of the best plays on the slate. If he gets 30 minutes against the Wizards or 32 minutes against the Wizards at $6,900, he should be one of the best plays on the slate. So I do think he should be popular. I'm not really convinced he should be 63% owned. I think maybe it ends up coming in that like 40 to 50% range, and I'd be a little bit more comfortable there.
So they blew Dallas out in that game. They won by like 27 points or 25 points. He didn't close the game out. The final 6 minutes, he was on the bench. He played a very short stint in the fourth quarter. I would imagine if that game was closer, he probably closes it out. I don't know. Only 3 minutes in the fourth. He also only played a short stint in the second quarter, but it was encouraging to see that his first rotation was 8 minutes long. So it's not necessarily like Silas is worried that he has to play in short spurts. That's why after playing 21 minutes, almost 21 minutes in that game, I feel a little bit more comfortable saying I would assume he closes this game out. And I think his second rotation, and his rotation to start the second half is a little bit longer than they were. But that's just a guess.
Yeah, and like if you give him 6 more minutes in that game and he gets to 26 or 27, then you're feeling pretty good. That first half rotation is just what concerns me because he only played 12 minutes for no apparent reason. But again, if I assume he was going to close the fourth quarter too, so it does make me think he probably gets like 28 to 30 minutes at least.
What are we doing with Victor Oladipo? We loved him in his debut with Houston at a $7,500 price point. He's come up in salary a little bit now, but a little bit more competition on this team now with Cousins at the 5. And I guess it wouldn't make a difference if Wood was there too, but also John Wall back in action, and we're assuming he plays 28, 30 minutes. Thoughts on Depot?
I still think he's a good option. He's obviously not the same option that he was when Wall was out because he's going to lose some ball handling responsibilities. He's going to lose some usage and all of that, but it's not like Oladipo is coming over to the Rockets from a team where he was the clear number one guy, and now he has to share the ball. He was playing with Malcolm Brogdon and Domantas Sabonis, which they're obviously different players, but from kind of a proxy standpoint and trying to account for the usage and the assists that playing with Wall and playing with Cousins is going to take away, it's not really that dissimilar. And he still averaged well over fantasy point per minute this year. He had a usage rate in the mid-20s. I'm pulling it up now. I had the wrong page up, but he was really productive with Indiana. I think that he's going to get similar opportunities with Houston. 1.14 DraftKings points per minute, 26% usage rate, just shy of a 19% assist percentage. I think that you could see the same opportunities for him here. Probably plays 32 to 34 minutes. Great matchup against the Wizards. The price tag has obviously come up, so there's a little bit more risk there, but I do still think that he's a pretty strong option.
What about the auxiliary options for Houston here? Small slate. Maybe there's a little bit to talk about, but with Daniel House back in the rotation, with Oladipo back after resting, John Wall back, Eric Gordon doesn't exactly have that same appeal that he might have, especially at 6,700. Can we talk about anyone else here that might make for a viable option today?
I don't really see anything that I like. So all that I would say is like maybe you get to them if you're like 150 maxing larger field tournaments because it is such a good matchup. But it's just a situation where you're getting a healthier team and you have a bunch of players who don't produce at a very high per minute rate that have had their prices increase because they were playing a lot and now they're not going to play as much. Like Jason Tate, you assume is going to play at best like 26, 28 minutes. His salaries come up. Nwaba and Sterling Brown should both lose minutes with House being back. Eric Gordon loses usage, especially assuming that Wall and Oladipo have their minutes staggered. So Gordon's always on the floor with one of them. PJ Tucker could be on the floor by himself, and he's only going to shoot 9% of the time. It's just really, really tough to feel good about any of these secondary guys. Ben McLemore at 3,400. I'm not confident he plays more than like 14 to 16 minutes, but he is the type of guy where he certainly could get hot against the Wizards and maybe play a little bit more. Maybe has a role if you're 150 maxing, but again, you're more often than not, you're expecting low teens in fantasy production out of him. So it's definitely not something you're going to feel good about. Overall, like it's Cousins, Wall, and Oladipo as the players that I like. And then the rest, it's kind of just, if I get to them, it would be because they're really low owned and I'm trying to win a tournament on a 3-game slate.
Cousins, Wall, and Oladipo right now are 1, 2, and 6 in projected ownership on DraftKings. 1, 2, and 6 on FanDuel. You've got Cousins at 1, you've got Wall at 3, and Oladipo at 8. So it's pretty wild. again, it makes sense. Highest implied total. The usage is going to be really heavily concentrated between those guys. Cousins can do everything we just talked about. And John Wall, if he gets the minutes, is there. But Adam, as you mentioned, he might not. So maybe that's a spot where you take some stands against Wall. But if you want to check our ownership out, you want to check our projections out, the awesome boom bust tool that you'll hear us reference all the time on the show, the top stack tool. Adam's article is free, but it's on the site. All of our premium articles, the lineup builder, the fantasy cruncher add-on, all of these tools built by Awesemo himself. See it, the logo right there. That's him, Alex Baker, #1 ranked player. He uses these tools. He's won a ton of money building or using the same tools that he built, and you can do the same. Come join the community, guys. Awesemo.com/join. You want a pass for $3.95 a week, express pass, or a monthly all access. You could do a single sport. You can make it a real investment. Do all access annual. You can do one sport, NFL annual, NBA, MLB, hockey, MMA, NASCAR, PGA, you name it. We got you covered. Everything at awesemo.com. The preeminent tools in the industry. It's time to start winning, fellas. We'll see you over there. If you have any questions, you can hit me up on Twitter at Laffy_D. My DMs are open. And last thing, join the Slack chat. If you do join and become a member at Awesemo and buy a subscription and join the community, access everything you can, which would be Slack chat. You have a great community there, but more importantly, you have the opportunity to talk to some of the pros that are at our site, from Adam to Alex to Steve to Colts and so many more. All of them. Ben Rasa answering your questions in the office hours. They pop in there, one of them, two of them every day, and take your questions in a more intimate setting. So check it out, awesemo.com/join. We'll see you over there. All right. You ready to close it out with New York and Utah?
Not really, but we may as well.
I know there's really not a ton here at all.
I hate this game.
So do I. It's not great. Reggie Bullock is out, so we have that cool news. Aside from that, the Jazz are 11-point favorites at home, 212 over under on this. The Knicks have a 100.5 implied total, Adam. Not only is it the lowest tonight, but it's the lowest by almost 8 full points. I get it's a small slate, but this does not look like a particularly appealing spot for your New York Knicks on this West Coast road trip.
Yeah, not only do you have a tough matchup with the Jazz, who we know the Knicks are good defensively and play at the slowest pace in the league.
Game is slow as shit, too.
Yeah, the Jazz are ranked 23rd in pace, and they're the third most efficient defense in the league. But on top of that, there's
the Knicks play at an even slower pace. The Knicks are playing at the slowest pace in the league by a full possession.
Yeah, Knicks are the slowest team in the league and 4th in defensive rating. Jazz are 23rd and 3rd. So it just has the makings of an ugly fantasy game anyway. But if you look at New York's rotation last game, I think that there are some concerns you can take away from that as well. I know that it was either you or Alex had asked me recently if I thought that Julius Randle would start losing minutes. And I think that you're still going to see a lot of minutes going to him. But I do think that his 37 to 38 minute per game season average probably takes a little bit of a step back. And you see some more games where he misses that mark by quite a bit, like he did last game where he only played 33. Now that Obi Toppin is healthy, he's back in the rotation, played about 16 minutes last game. You had Kevin Knox play decent minutes as well, which took time away from RJ Barrett, in addition to Austin Rivers taking minutes away from Barrett. The Knicks are getting healthier. Not only can Toppin potentially take minutes away from Randle, Burks being in the lineup potentially takes ball handling responsibilities or assisting opportunities away from Randle. So it's not that Randle doesn't still have a high ceiling. It's just that you have this combination now of an elevated price point, more potential minutes downside because he has a backup that they want to play, and a really difficult matchup. So it makes it hard to get there. Kind of the same thing for Barrett. Obviously not the same fantasy per minute producer as Randle, but he's also less expensive. But he's competing now with Alec Burks and with, for touches. Burks a much higher usage guy than Reggie Bullock, being the point. Austin Rivers is going to get minutes as well. So I think maybe you see Barrett too go from like 37 to 34 minutes on most nights. And that's a problem, especially when you consider this matchup. So I think that's concerning. You had it, last game, Emmanuel quickly showed his upside. Him and Peyton each played 24 minutes. That would be an interesting spot to go to in tournaments had Quickly's price not jumped to almost the same as Peyton on both DraftKings and FanDuel. It just makes it really tough to like either of those guys much.
Hey, did you see the rotations last game?
How do you mean?
You would know. Elfrid Payton and Quickly?
24 and 24.
Yeah, but Alfred played the entire first, Quickly played the entire second. Alfred played the entire third and quickly played the entire fourth.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that when I looked.
Crazy, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of just like if you're going to one of those guys, I think I would still lean towards Peyton just because he gets the first opportunity to play well, and they're basically the same price, but you're not going to feel good about either one. If I'm going to the Knicks here, I think the spots that I'm most interested in are Alec Burks, who is only 5,300 on DraftKings and FanDuel. He's averaged about a fantasy point per minute when he's on the floor with Randle this year. You would expect that to come down due to the matchup, but he is a capable scorer and he can pick up some assists as well. And then if you're playing large field tournaments and wanted to take a stab at like, I don't know, a $3,100 top-in or something, it's kind of the same thing as Ben McLemore. McLemore obviously is in the better matchup, but the same thinking where it's like if Randle gets in foul trouble or something and Toppin plays 18 or 20 minutes, he might be a good play at low ownership, but obviously not anything that you're doing and feeling good about or should be doing very often at all. It's just a really gross spot, I think.
All right, maybe a slightly less gross spot with Utah. It's not really that fantasy friendly, but at least they have a higher total, 111.5. That's not bad. They're 11-point favorites. They're that's easy to say. Double-digit favorites at home against this team. Like we said, both of them play very slow pace. Both of them have played really well defensively, top 5 apiece. You have some potential value in guys like Ingles. Donovan Mitchell's playing well. Rudy Gobert has been a topic of conversation, but ultimately, this is still one of my less. I'm still not feeling a great amount of enjoyment about the Utah Jazz, but it's better than the Knicks.
Yeah, I mean the Jazz at least have a higher implied total than the Clippers. It's about the same as the Hawks. There's at least some pieces here that you can feel reasonably good about, even though the matchup sucks as far as the Knicks being good defensively and the Knicks being really slow. Rudy Gobert in particular, I think still a little bit underpriced. His minutes average for the season, not quite where you'd want it to be, but if this game does happen to be competitive, you're probably still getting 32 to 34 minutes. He's averaged over 1.2 DraftKings points per minute this year, and the salary just really hasn't moved. So again, the center of position just doesn't have that much. You have Cousins, you have Len as value, you have Capela at the top. Ibaka's fine, but you don't have those guys that are almost guaranteed to score 55 plus fantasy points, keeping you off of Gobert today. So I do have some interest there. Mitchell and Conley are relatively high upside guys. You're getting more minutes from Mitchell. The issue with Conley has been that he's only averaging 29.9 minutes per game. Mitchell typically getting into the mid 30s. Mitchell's averaged about 1.2 DraftKings points per minute. Conley about 1.14. So both of those guys, have upside. Same goes for Jordan Clarkson, who his minutes are hit or miss, especially with Joe Ingles being back. But if he's playing well, he can still give you 28 to 30 minutes of 1.15 fantasy point per minute production. So, a decent ceiling there. Definitely more interest in the Utah side as sort of like last guys in, whereas the Knicks side, it's like I am going to feel really gross if I get there.
Someone mentioning Kobe games for some of his friends tonight. Rest in peace, Kobe, 1 year anniversary. I remember when
Beal.
people were saying that you had to hammer the Lakers in the Kobe tribute game against the Portland Trailblazers. Portland Trailblazers won that game outright. So
yeah, Dame Lillard scored like 100 points. I said Dame Lillard scored like 100 points in that game.
Yep.
It was one of the games.
He knocked down pretty much every shot he took, and he was taking those half court threes. And he was
taking half court pull up threes. If you want to play the Kobe narrative, Trae Young, Bradley Beal, both guys that you would look to.
Yep. Are you buying it?
No.
The reason I don't buy it is because why are we to believe that the Kobe narrative means you're going to play better? It could definitely mean you're going to play worse too if you're not in the right headspace.
You ever think about that? I'm not buying it for the same reason I never buy narratives. Like, it's not that they don't exist. It's not that sometimes guys won't have a big game and then they come out and say, yeah, I was really pissed off by XYZ or I was motivated by whatever. It's that you don't know that until after the fact. I don't think there's no reason to think going in that Trae Young is going to go take 50 shots or something. And Trae Young's a really good play anyway. Bradley Beal's a really good play anyway. Like, right. They're really good plays on their own merits without trying to guess what headspace they're in because Kobe Bryant died a year ago.
Exactly. And things just affect people in different ways. So, if you're assuming one way or the other, you might be right, you might be wrong. I don't know. Would you say you have any top plays from Utah and the New York Knicks?
Not in the context of the entire slate. Like, I think if I'm just saying top plays from the game, I would say Gobert and Mitchell. But when you look at the entire slate, like I would rather roster Trae Young or Bradley Beal than Mitchell if I can find the salary. I'd rather roster Cousins, obviously, than Gobert. So more so top plays from the game than the slate.
All right, we got about 1 minute here before we turn this one over to the Live Before Lock crew. It's Chris Spags, it's Greg Ehrenberg taking you up till 7:30 for this 3-gamer. Let's do this, Adam. Our top plays for the slate overall. If you're building a single entry tournament lineup, right? No, actually, you know what? Let's say, yeah, single entry tournament lineup, but it's a pretty large field, right? So it's not one of these small, pretty decent sized field, single entry. Who are you starting the lineup with, and who would be your favorite lower owned option today?
I'd like to start it with Young, Beal, and Cousins. It still leaves you 5K. So I'm going to try at least and start with Young, Beal, and Cousins and then find some value somewhere. As far as what did you say?
Just a lower owned option just to get a little different. It is a 3-game slate after all.
Yeah, I mean, so right now Young's not getting that much ownership, but you can use Alex Len for value. He's 15% owned. Reggie Jackson only 6% right now. I think either of those guys would make sense.
Okay, for me, I think some Serge Ibaka can be worked in as well. I know he's only center eligible, and he's a little expensive, but no ownership. We know that he's a higher usage player that can really do a ton of damage when he gets the opportunity. And for that reason, I'll plug him in as well. Thanks to you all guys for watching. As always, good luck tonight. Before you actually don't go anywhere, just stay right here on the stream, but hit that thumbs up. And again, subscribe to the channel. It is the easiest, freest, and simplest way to help support us so we can keep putting out fire content like this every day. Good luck today, guys. We'll see you back here tomorrow, same time or around the same time on the Deeper Dive. Peace.
Cool. See you guys.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, friends.
Jordan, long time no see. Greg, it'll please you to know that I called Eric Gregg again on the test show he did today. You're just inundating my life with your name.
Absolutely devastating. I'm one of a kind.
Hello, everyone. You are now 1 hour away from lock time at all the NBA DFS sites you'll be playing on, and that means it's time for an Awesemo Live Before Lock show. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you're a new person around here, and keep your eyes peeled for all the content we have going on all day long. NBA, NFL, MMA, PGA. If it's out there, NHL. How could I forget NHL? If we have it, if it's a sport, we're going to have some content on this channel. I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man who's going to help me go through all the finer points today's 3-game slate. Some of his friends know him as Nerd Ass Greg. You also know him as Nerd Ass Greg. He's Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, what friends? Who are these? Who are these people? I just have my Zoom friends. I talk to you. I talk to Jordan, and that's pretty much it. So this is going to be a really interesting slate, especially talking about FanDuel versus DraftKings, because this is the most different I could ever remember them being, because FanDuel did not adjust for the Clippers news in their pricing. DraftKings did build it into their pricing algorithm. We knew that these guys were going to be out today. FanDuel was like, hey, maybe it's not a big deal. We'll just run with our pricing as is. And DK was like, maybe we should do something about it. So the exposure I have across the two different sites is wildly different for this slate.
There's going to be a lot to hit on. And of course, a slate like this, really every slate that, I'm going to say that for all these shows we do, because it is always important to get Awesemo Plus data in your life. So if you want to get in on all the player projections, the ownership projections, the boom bust tool, all the things that Awesemo himself, Alex Baker, uses to build so many great lineups that have won him countless millions and millions of dollars. Make sure you're going to awesemo.com/join and check out all the packages we have on there right now for NBA, for all the sports. It's going to be a big asset. We just also got ownership ownership coming through. So if you guys want a sneak peek of the top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel, make sure you smash that like button. The back half of the show, as Greg knows and loves more than anybody, that's money time. That's what we call it around here. And that means we give away our top 5 owned plays if you guys get us to 1,000 likes. So make sure you hit that like button, smash it, obliterate it, tickle it, tenderly love it, whatever you need to do, but hit that like button now. And again, subscribe here as we are on that march to 50K subscribers that our pal Lofty wants so bad. And I'll be damned if I disappoint him. So make sure you guys hit that subscribe button now and get in there. We're going to have some big giveaways coming when we hit 50K subscribers here on YouTube. But Greg, I guess let's go slate by slate here because, we do have the differences with DraftKings and FanDuel, as you mentioned. But I do think, actually, here's one play that's universal on both sites. So we can start here, get on the same page with our DraftKings friends and our FanDuel friends. DeMarcus Cousins, once again, the chalk play on both sites. Neither site really wants to commit to giving him his old, let's say, Pelicans pricing, certainly not the Lakers or the Warriors pricing, but he's looked like the old Pelicans. DeMarcus Cousins, been a monster so far, has at least 15 shots in his last 2 games with no Christian Wood. We are going to have our first game with both Oladipo and John Wall available for the Rockets. But what are you doing with Cousins? And I'll disclose right now, I have currently 100% DeMarcus Cousins on DraftKings after Dwight Howard worked out so well for me last night.
I don't have quite 100%, but he is my highest owned player on this slate. Actually, that's not true. On DraftKings, he's not my highest owned player. On FanDuel, Cousins is my highest owned player. Actually, John Wall is my highest owned player on TK. But yeah, I mean, I still think that he's one of the top plays on the slate. Him and John Wall, for sure, are my 2 favorite plays. And like you said, I mean, Cousins is pretty much back to the player he was before, at least from a fantasy standpoint. We've seen in his last 2 starts 35 and 50 fantasy points. And it's just, we look at the Rockets lineup and how beat up they are right now without Christian Wood there. They basically just said, hey, Boogie, you're just going to play all the center minutes you can handle. You're going to play until you foul out, which is basically what he's doing right now. He plays, he gets into foul trouble, comes out of the game. But last game, I mean, we saw him play 31 minutes, 30 minutes the game before he played 33. So I was a little concerned when we first saw him move into the starting lineup. I was like, yeah, Boogie, in terms of points per minute producer, is going to be great, but I wasn't exactly sure what to expect from him from a playing time perspective. Doesn't seem like it's going to be an issue anymore.
Washington, I think the one argument you could make is that the pace here, Washington playing at always playing at a fast pace, but this year, right up there amongst all the teams that we talk about here, pace normally a good thing for a guy like Cousins coming off of some of those leg issues. I could maybe have some concern with that. And one interesting thing, which I don't know that it matters that much, but for whatever reason, I think in part because of the pace, Washington only allowing 10% of their opponents, or 13%, of their opponents' field goal attempts at the rim. So that to me says maybe the bigs, because of the ball moving so fast, not able to get in position. So I don't think that's a cause for concern overall. I think overall projection-wise and price-wise on DraftKings, I just find it hard to get away from Cousins. And people in the chat saying that Cousins not the same player as Howard, that's not really what I'm talking about. And when I compare the two, it's more that when you have a big who's just at a value price for the projection you would have, I think it's a spot you want to load up. And I'm still with Cousins, even if 100% might be too much for Greg. But Greg, give me the number then. What are you getting for the percentages of ownership that you have for Cousins on DraftKings as well as FanDuel?
I'm right around 90%. So it's not like I don't have some egregious number. It was just that, like, on FanDuel, I wanted to have some lineups with Rudy Gobert. On DraftKings, I also like Rudy Gobert a little bit. And then there's also some crappier centers I like Alex Len and PJ Tucker that I wanted to get exposure to. So he just didn't show up in 100% of my lineup. So that doesn't mean that I don't have an egregious amount of DeMarcus Cousins, where I'll certainly be furious when he gets ejected in the first quarter for, like throwing his headband at the ref or something.
So I'm with you on your John Wall take, but we just got the Wizards lineup, and now I think we actually have to talk about this one. The Wizards shorthanded because of COVID protocols. Really, everybody who you can name who aren't Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook are not in that game today for the most part. But Anthony Gill picking up the start for Washington on the year. Gill has an 8% usage rate, an 11% rebound rate, has not, from what I can tell, had a single assist. So to me, he is just a body, but I guess a body you could maybe see get some minutes. And obviously is a very small sample size for Anthony Gill's rates. So not something that, you can necessarily take to the bank that he'll always be this player. But I don't know. I guess Anthony Gill at a minimum salary, Greg, you haven't had any time to think about this at all, but how do you feel about Anthony Gill now that we know he's starting?
Word. I mean, like, it was definitely, I didn't come in today thinking like, oh, I'm going to talk about Anthony Gill a lot. He was not somebody who was on my radar at all. What isn't going to help Anthony Gill's usage rate is playing alongside Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal in that starting lineup. Really what I think the big impact here in terms of my lineups is I thought Jerome Robinson was one of the better value plays on the slate, and now I'm going to have to downgrade him. So in terms of Gill himself, I don't want to say I'm not going to get to him. I'm definitely not going to have him projected overly well for his price tag. I maybe will end up with like 5 to 10% of them just because there are guys I want to pay up for on the slate. Really, the big news here is Jerome Robinson not starting. I'm going to have to decrease his minutes a decent amount. And he's going to be somebody who's now going to be a lesser part of my lineups.
Yeah, the last time that Gill started was December 19th against Detroit. He played 16 minutes, had a 10.6% usage rate, and shot 1 for 3 as he contributed 1.5 fantasy points. So I think if you're going to a guy like Gill, you're certainly not expecting a big day, though. Maybe this high totaled game, a 232 combined total here for this one, Washington and Houston. Maybe that's somehow Gill rises with that tide. But as of right now, I don't think there's a lot of reason to go to Gill besides maybe he open some things up that you might like that you couldn't get otherwise.
Yeah. And it would, if this was a slate that had any more than 3 games, even if it had 4 games, I'd probably have 0% Gill. And I'm going to update. He's not someone I'm going to get to on FanDuel. I'm pretty confident in that because of the difference in minimum salary. But I'm going to update my DraftKings lineups right now. And I'll tell you if I end up getting to Anthony Gill at all. My gut feeling is a very low percentage, but maybe it ends up being nothing. So I'll know that in like 3 minutes.
Yeah, and we'll give you this one for free because honestly, probably a lot of you watching the stream, no disrespect, because I barely knew Anthony Gill was either, but may not even know who he was. But he's projected by Awesemo to get 20 minutes and has a 15.8 fantasy point projection on DK scoring. So that's one thing to note there. I'm going to put this stuff in, but let's go back to, I guess let's talk the rest of the Wizards while we're talking about these guys, because Garrison Matthews, Jerome Robinson were 2 guys I was getting before. I think the minutes should still be there overall, but I guess you probably, as Greg mentioned, have to give them a little bit of a haircut. So I'll put the numbers in and see what I'm getting here. But the rest of the Wizards, Bradley Beal, 45% usage rate last game with Russell Westbrook coming back from an injury. Westbrook was minutes limited here. I think today Awesemo has him playing 32 minutes. Even that might be a little ambitious. I think we'll find out quickly in that game. But Beal, to me, the strongest play. I think no brave take there on the Wizards. But are you getting anybody else in a meaningful amount, I guess, with whatever fluctuations we're going to have for guys like Matthews and Robinson?
By the way, I do not have any exposure to Anthony Gill after rerunning my lineups right here on DK. So there we go. The big update. No Anthony Gill exposure. And I definitely feel good also that Alex doesn't have him projected all that well. It's hard to find usage for him, like I said, with Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal in that starting lineup. Talking about Beal for a second, how ridiculous is it that his usage is maintained playing alongside Russell Westbrook this year? I thought that he was really going to decrease, and he leads the league in scoring so far this season. The usage rate is sky high. Russell Westbrook himself hasn't been very good, and he's also missed games due to numerous issues. But even when they've played together, it's been a complete non-issue. It's basically been Westbrook and Beal take all the shots, and nobody else touches the ball. That's kind of how they've managed it. But I really thought coming into the year that Beal was going to take a hit in terms of fantasy value, and that does not appear to be the case at all.
Yeah, I think you're seeing enough staggered minutes to have obviously a little bit of unencumbered run for both guys. And yeah, I think overall, there's just enough possessions to go around. A 2-star teams tend to work a little better than the 3-star teams, as we've kind of seen so far with the Nets, with those guys trying to figure out their footing with Beal and Westbrook, and especially a minutes limited Westbrook. I think it's hard to imagine there being not much of a floor for Beal. And most recent round of ownership we had, Greg, for Beal had 43% ownership going his way. I think, let me just pull up my most recent crunch because I'm actually going to change some things, but I had Beal a little bit more than that. I didn't end up going crazy on him as much as some other guys, but where are you landing relative to the field with Beal on DraftKings as well as FanDuel?
Yeah, so on DraftKings, I'm right around even with the field, slightly overweight, but not anything significant. On FanDuel, I'm a little bit heavier overweight just because you look at the shooting guard options on FanDuel, and they just really stink. I know that like a lot of the ownership is going towards Luke Kennard. And I'm fine with Luke Kennard, except it's hard for me to be overweight to Luke Kennard at 5,500 when he's in the mid 20s in terms of ownership. So the guy that I took the most overweight stance on was Bradley Beal. There's enough value on FanDuel where you could kind of pay up wherever you want to. And it just made sense to go to Beal, who, at least on FanDuel, the price difference between him and guys like Oladipo and Mitchell, it's not all that significant. I'm projected so much higher than those guys that I think that he's easily the top shooting guard option. So I think that on FanDuel, I'm just looking through other shooting guards that I even have a decent amount of exposure to. There's Herter, I like a lot. I have some exposure to Mitchell and Oladipo. But relative to ownership, it's Bradley Beal for me on FanDuel.
Yeah, I think that's a fair play. I mean, Beal on both sides going to be certainly represented well in terms of ownership. Obviously going to be normally on any of these slates where you do have a high total like that with Beal, and B, a minutes limited Russell Westbrook, or, at least one that's going to be a little more limited than usual, Beal's going to pop up. But on a short slate, especially, Beal looking very chalky on both sides. And again, get those ownership projections for yourself at awesemo.com/join. But if you want to get a little sneak preview here and get the top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel, we'll give you guys at 7 p.m. Eastern if you guys get to 1,000 likes on the video. So smash that like button now. We'll give you guys those freebies. Let's jump over to the Clippers side of the game, the first game on today's slate, because that's another COVID protocol really affected game. In particular, no Kawhi, no Paul George. I think Beverly is not in health protocol. He's just regular hurt, but it doesn't matter. He's not playing. Clippers very shorthanded here in this spot. And Greg, I don't know if you've been tracking the line movements for this one, but it started the day, at least the most recent poll that I had, was a 5-point spread favoring Atlanta. And that was when we had Trae Young and Capela questionable. Has there been a move here at all where we're expecting more of a blowout from Vegas?
So actually the line opened this morning at 2.5. I know, because I have that number. And what happened was then there was speculation that it looked like that Trae Young was closer to playing than sitting, but it was still kind of up in the air. And the line started to move more in favor of Atlanta. And now I think, let's see, it was at 5 when we started, but that was also only shortly after Trae Young was ruled in. I think it's either at 5 or 5.5 right now. 6 actually now the Hawks are favored by. So the reason being, is just because we have Capela and Trae Young in, they were both questionable and they were uncertain earlier in the day. And as they became more likely to play and ultimately ruled in, the line moved more in favor of the Hawks. I think this is pretty interesting to talk about because it kind of relates to something I talked about yesterday with the Pistons as individual plays going up against the 76ers. One thing that I think is very difficult to build into projections and is very, very hard to account for is when a player gets ruled out. It's easy to say which player on their team benefits, right? Joel Embiid's out. We know Dwight Howard's starting. In theory, he should have a good fantasy game. Didn't necessarily happen to be the case yesterday, but most of the time that happens. The other thing also is that Joel Embiid's one of the best defensive players in the league. Therefore, there's a big impact on the other side of the game. Therefore, the Pistons have an easier matchup. It's hard to build that into projections, though. And I kind of think we have the same thing with the Hawks today, where if you're just looking at it on paper, the Clippers are a difficult matchup. But with Patrick Beverly, Paul George, and Kawhi Leonard all out, I don't think their defense is anywhere near as strong. So I think guys like Trae Young get grossly underprojected for this type of matchup.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think it also depends how you're looking at, how you pull your projections, and the Vegas total would for the most part account for it. But I agree, like the per 100 numbers, which is how I build my personal projections, and a lot of other similar projections out there are built that same way. That doesn't account for it because you're right. You're looking at a longer term sample in which the Clippers do have Paul George, do have Kawhi out there, certainly adding a lot better wing defense than they'll get from a very aged Nick Batum and Terrence Mann and Lou Williams in the second unit. Like, it's not going to be great. So I think that's fair. I'm pretty heavy on the Hawks side, but I want to get really deep on the Clippers here because we have a lot of time to kill. It is that 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific lock. So you guys have some time in case you're concerned and confused, as many people, myself included, often get by these changing times. But the Clippers, I think overall, I'm curious who your number one play is because it looked like Marcus Morris for me when I assumed he'd be starting. And to me now, I think it's still Kennard, but Kennard's ownership is so high that I don't know that I want to get there. And on DraftKings, as you talked about earlier, not the same equation as FanDuel. So on DraftKings, give me not a ranking, but at least give me who you are feeling at least the most comfortable about for the Clippers.
All right. So it is Marcus Morris still for me on DraftKings, even though he's coming off the bench at his price of 4,700. He's the one guy who's cheaper on DraftKings than he is on FanDuel. He is 5,000 on FanDuel, 4,700 on DraftKings. And it's all these other guys on the Clippers are so much more expensive on DK that I think a lot of them don't necessarily make for terrific plays, at least not as much as you would think when you first got the news that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and Patrick Beverly were all out. So relative to price, it's still Marcus Morris for me. There's other guys I have in the player pool like Luke Kennard, but I'm still underweight to the field on Kennard. I have some exposure to Lou Williams, some exposure to Reggie Jackson, but still all of these guys, I think they're about appropriately priced. It's a different story when we talk about FanDuel where some of these guys are like min price, but at least for DK purposes, it's Marcus Morris for me.
Yeah, I think Morris to me in my most recent crunch, I still had him a little bit more than the field. And I think too, as his ownership comes down, he might become a little more appealing just because he's going to get some bench run. He will still be getting bench run alongside Lou Williams, who maybe questionable motivation after visiting his favorite wing establishments / gentlemen's. You can always see Jordan perk up. I don't know if Jordan perked up because he knew he was going to the strip club joke or because I said wings.
Which, and by the way, it could be all the above, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But and that's a real narrative we need to talk about. Lou Williams only he's 15 minutes away from Magic City playing that. That's a big deal. And by the way, not to get too far off track, but there's something I wanted to update. Now that I downgraded Jerome Robinson because I forgot to do that when I ran my lineups before, I have actual exposure to Anthony Gill now just because there was a lack of value plays that I liked on DK.
Ooh, Anthony Gill soaring up the charts only to inevitably put up 8 fantasy points. What's the over under?
Which, by the way, I have him for 14 fantasy points and he's still showing up in some of my lineups just because there's a real lack of value on DK. And I really like some of the expensive guys, or at least some of the pricier guys relative to the slate. So Bradley Beal, Trae Young, I like a lot. DeMarcus Cousins, who at least, for this slate, he's one of the more expensive players because we don't have, like a Luka or anything on it. So just to get those guys, I needed value somewhere. And I had a bunch of Jerome Robinson before, not really an option for me anymore. So now I've got Anthony Gill and his my 14 fantasy point projection for him showing up in a handful of my lineups.
Let's see, the boom bust tool for Gill has him. He's got a 1.7% chance of getting into the optimal, and he'll be 2.9% owned in our most recent run of ownership. So Anthony Gill, I think it's going to be very upsetting if he somehow ends up going nuts or just something strange happens here, because I feel like everything says it's probably not a good play, and honestly a little bit of a fishy play. Not in any disparaging way. If you feel like Anthony Gill's a great play, go for it. But a minimum price guy with no usage playing alongside Beal and Westbrook, and if he ends up over 10% owned, I feel like that's where things get a little dicey.
So here's the deal with Anthony Gill. I think that him ending up in the optimal lineup has less to do with how well he plays. Obviously, if he scores 25 fantasy points, it's a different story. If he scores 10 fantasy points, he still could end up in the optimal lineup if Trae Young scores 50 plus fantasy points, if John Wall scores 50 plus fantasy points. I think him ending up in the optimal lineup has more to do with what the high-end guys do on the slate, because who else are you paying for around mid-price?
Yeah, no, I mean, we talk about a lot here, the cheaper salary guys, especially guys at a minimum salary. It's really about what they open up for you, the other guys you can get as a result. And for the most part, those 3K guys aren't going to be the one who kills you. Honestly, even in some of the big DK tournaments yesterday, I mentioned, I had 100% Dwight Howard. I was still profitable in the night, which sucked because he killed a lot of lineups that actually would have had a shot to be live, but there were tournament winners with Dwight Howard. So I think it's not crazy to assume, even on a short slate, maybe Anthony Gill gets you there. Just on paper, it's not seemed like the best play overall. Other Wizards that I'm curious your thoughts on. Garrison Matthews is somebody who's popping up for me before, and I'm going to find out what I have for him now. Overall, I don't think he's a guy who's going to come up, but do you see yourself getting any Garrison Matthews, any Isaac Bonga, even Robin Lopez, who could have a nice spot here going against a Rockets team that does give up a lot of shots at the rim?
So I didn't get to Bonga. I got to, I think, I'm uploading my lines right now, but I'm pretty sure that I had right around 20% exposure to Garrison Matthews. By the way, I always label my CSVs just so I remember what it is, the last change I made. So I try to make it organized so that I could click on the right one when I upload it. My latest CSV is named Anthony Gill. So that should hopefully bring a little bit of luck. Garrison Matthews, I have 25% right now on DK. On FanDuel, I was a little bit higher on Garrison Matthews, once again, just because the small forward plays absolutely suck on FanDuel. The most expensive small forward on FanDuel is RJ Barrett at 7,500. And he's actually picking up ownership at that price playing against Utah. So that goes to show how bad the FanDuel small forward options are, where you have a 7,500 RJ Barrett playing in Utah with 20% ownership. So just because those are kind of who he stacked up against, I think that Garrison Matthews at 4,300 is actually one of the stronger small forward plays on FanDuel. And I have some exposure to him on DK as well.
I just saw somebody in the chat, and I think it just scrolled by. Chat's moving fairly fast here. So shout out to all you guys watching. And again, if you are watching, we got about 3,600 people in here, and we are going to give away the top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel. Not all of the plays, so have no fear. Awesemo Plus members in the chat, you're not really losing a whole lot of value there. But make sure you hit that like button. We'll give you guys those plays in about 8 minutes coming up here. Get us to 1,000 likes, and that's the number that we need to hit in order for me to give those away to you guys. Again, a question here, though, about Jerome Robinson and why, I guess, why we feel like he's a degraded play or a downgraded play. Maybe not degraded. Maybe after tonight he'll be a degraded play as well. But Jerome Robinson, to me, I think the issue that I'll have with my lineups is that I'll probably still get him in some, but for me now he projects under 5x value. You know, that's not a perfect marker. That's sort of an old school NBA DFS marker, but still, for the most part, you do want your guys to be a little bit higher projected, or, you know, at least be guys who have a real actual high ceiling here. Jerome Robinson doesn't have, but if you give him 28 minutes, which I think Awesemo has him at, actually, no, it's 28. Yeah, it's 20. Yeah. So you give him whatever amount of minutes that Awesemo has him at, it's not causing him to come up too well. And I think that's really the difference here. You shave 4 or 5 minutes off of a guy like Jerome Robinson, the median projection is going to drop a lot, and you can still go there. But if 36% of the field's going to be there, it just makes Jerome Robinson overall not a guy you want to be on quite as much.
Yeah, I'd rather be on Anthony Gill. That's where we want to put our money. So here's the other thing with Jerome Robinson. He started the last 2 games, and he's not starting tonight. So we have to figure he plays less minutes now. You know, he had a big fantasy game and started last time out, but that's not going to be the case. Instead, they're going with the stalwart and Anthony Gill, who, you know, I mean, of course, because how can you not start Anthony Gill in this sort of situation? So just because he's coming off the bench, it's easy to downgrade him and expect he plays less minutes.
And our boy Jeremiah Johnson posted in the YouTube chat, really infringing on the domain of our news god, but we appreciate Jeremiah, one of the regulars here. Shout out to you, buddy, for always being in the chat, pointing out from some tweets here, Russell Westbrook will have a minutes limit in the mid-20s, and then John Wall will have his minutes monitored. He's the guy we need to talk about next, because right now, I'm going to sort my lineups as we talk, but I had him as being one of my highest owned plays, even with him being extremely chalky on DraftKings. How are you feeling about Wall, and how do you feel about the concept of his minutes being monitored, which, depending on the coach, can just mean literally watching his minutes and going, oh yeah, all right, he's good, keep playing.
Yeah, monitored is just the worst terminology. There's so much coach speak I hate, but monitored, I mean, because it's like, we're going to pay attention to it. It's like what you don't pay attention to it normally, right? Like monitor could literally mean, oh, I look over the scoreboard. If you're like, hey, look at that. He's played 32 minutes so far. Cool.
Great job.
Right? Yeah. Like, all right, that's monitoring it technically. He's watched it. He sees what it is. He goes, hey, good job by you. You played 32 minutes so far. So I'm not too concerned about John Wall's minutes. I don't expect him to play 40 or anything like that, but I think for his price on FanDuel and DraftKings, 6,900 on DK, 7,700 on FanDuel. And I am not much for narratives in NBA DFS. I generally think they're stupid. I don't care whose birthday it is. I don't care what teams players used to play on. With that said, John Wall used to be on the Wizards. There's a lot of bad blood there. And given some of his comments heading into the game, I do think that there's going to be more of an effort by the Rockets to give John Wall the ball and to let him score against his former team. So I'm buying into this narrative a little bit. I almost never play into these, but in this particular case, it seems like there's going to be an actual effort to get John Wall the ball and get him shots.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I care too much about that. I care really more about his price. And yeah, it looks like right now for me, I have a John Wall at about 70%. And this is just from my fresh little sorting here. The field's projected to be around 50%-ish. I just think Wall's in a good situation where people are afraid of the minutes. I'm willing to lean into it on a short slate in the hopes that he does get to 30. I mean, he played an 8-minute stint to open that game. The Deeper Dive guys actually went into a good amount of detail talking on the last show about some of the rotations there, but started with 8 minutes, had a weird short stint in the second quarter there where he didn't get the run. Fourth quarter ended up being a blowout. So we saw a few minutes cut off there. You know, wasn't looking hyper aggressive, I think, from what I could tell, but you're playing alongside DeMarcus Cousins will do that. But I just think if people are going to be afraid of Wall here, you know, it's still a fast-paced spot, still one where there should be some assist upside for him, even with Oladipo taking some stuff off the table here, as well as Cousins. I think just Wall, I'm finding it hard to get away from him, which normally it's easy to get away from a dude who's going to be 50% owned, and I'm still getting more. So I think to me that's sort of the testament on how much I believe in John Wall today.
So I actually think of the news we just got, I think the Westbrook one is pretty significant, especially because he was projected to be really popular on FanDuel. He's not supposed to be uber popular on DK, but he's expected to get some ownership. Russell Westbrook was projected for 40% ownership on FanDuel. And now we find out that he's going to be playing somewhere in the mid to high 20s minutes. That makes him a really weak play on this slate.
And also a little more love for Bradley Beal too. Like I'm already going to be pretty Beal heavy, but I think, you know, I agree. Like if you're going to get around 30-ish minutes of Westbrook as you know, the peak, even if they're lying to you, and probably less than that, I think Beal pops up even more for me. So I feel very confident Beal, even though I already felt fairly confident in Beal, obviously.
Yeah, I think all that extra usage goes to Anthony Gill now. I think that he picks it all up. I think we're going to see Anthony Gill with a career high 13% usage rate today.
And then he'll break the slate as everybody else in that price point around him goes off. Let's see. We got a super chat that our boy Jordan Klein behind the glass, always helping us out here, that I didn't get to in time. But Christian Smith asking, ownership seems very low on Capela on FanDuel. Are you playing him? I will say on DraftKings, I'm not playing his price up quite a bit there, though not above 10K like he is on FanDuel. But Greg, you're playing on both sites today. So tell me on FanDuel in particular, but also on DraftKings, how are you feeling about Clint Capela?
Yeah, I tried to get to Capela. I even manually boosted his projection just to be like, maybe I'll get 2% Clint Capela, and he's just not popping up in lineups. The price is too high, 10,500. We can only roster one center. I like Gobert a little bit. Obviously, I like Cousins a lot. And to me, just on a per dollar basis, both those guys are much stronger plays. And even in terms of overall projection, I have all three of them somewhat even. It's just that there's a big price drop where Capela's 10,500, then 8,300 for Gobert, 7,200 for Boogie. I'm not going to be getting to Capela. It's just too hard to get up to his price point.
The thing with Capela, and it sucks because I have missed out on his 2 big days recently. I actually talked on the last show, I think it was the game before last with Capela, where he really just obliterated everything. And I had to force my way to him, got to 15%, was still in the field, so he didn't help. Didn't have him on the slate, I think, the last time where he had the 10 block game. And, 10 blocks is a very impressive feat. The fact that he got a triple-double with blocks is amazing, but overall, he's only blocking 5% of shots, which is like actually still a very good mark, but you just can't expect that to move forward. And I feel like with where his price is, at a certain game, he's going to come back to where the median projections are. Like Awesemo has him at 39 DK points rounded up. That's not anywhere close to where you want to be on DraftKings. Same thing on FanDuel, where it's even more expensive. Though the blocks there, if he does pick up, even half of what he got last game, you're still going to be pretty happy. But I just feel like it's to the point where, Greg, you talk a lot about price sensitivity, and we got some time to fill before money time hits. So make sure you hit that like button, guys. But Greg, give me like a quick elevator pitch here on the concept of price sensitivity, because I feel like you've spelled it out pretty well before.
Yeah, so my thing always is I like to look at historical pricing for players, and I view them almost as like one of our sponsors, not for this show, but on other programs, Jock Market, where you're looking at players as literal stocks and how they go up and down in price. And I'm always looking at the historical price of players, and you're generally going to assume that whatever their average price is over time is about what we are going to want to expect them to be priced at. So when they're underpriced versus what they usually are. And by the way, this is one of the reasons I was very high on Capela a couple weeks ago. Remember, Capela was a guy who was in the 5,000 range. And I was saying about Capela, look, he's a guy who's typically priced around 8,000 on both FanDuel and DraftKings. Therefore, going forward, we're going to expect his price to normalize somewhere around 8,000. Now, I didn't expect that all of a sudden he was going to destroy and he was going to totally normalize, his stats were going to regress to the mean in the most ridiculously quick way possible. But now we've gotten to a point where it's gone so far in the other direction that it could only go down from here. He's 10,500. And you have to ask yourself, at the end of the season, is Capela going to be more or less expensive than 10,500? The answer is lower. Just like a couple weeks ago when we said, is Capela going to be more or less expensive than 5,800? The answer was higher. The real price from the fair price is somewhere in between. So I always want to buy on players when the price is low, and I want to sell on them when the price is high. So because Capela's price is apex, I don't necessarily think this is the best place to roster him. He's played extremely well recently, and that's why people want to roster him. But just think, 2 weeks ago, would you have played Clint Capela at 10,500? It would have seemed absolutely ridiculous. Just because he's had a few good games in a row doesn't mean all of a sudden you want to buy on him like he's GameStop or something.
I was thinking about a GameStop joke too, which I think is one of the funniest things that Reddit has ever done, breaking the stock market for one of some poor hedge funders out there. And then out of spite too, because the hedge funders were dicks about it. But
it's tremendous.
Yeah. If you haven't seen the GameStop story, it's worth a quick Google here. We'll spare you guys the details on this slate. So we got to 770 likes. It's still money time. So Jordan, what I need you to do. You know what I need you to do.
No, apparently he doesn't.
You know what time it is, Jordan.
There it is.
There we go. It's money time. If Jordan's bailing on me with the sound effects, I'm lost here. It's money time. It's a halfway point of the show. 775 likes, not quite 1,000, but I will give you guys the top 3 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel because I want to make sure we reinforce the concept here. You got to get to 1,000 likes. That's just a basic modicum of respect for your favorite host or your least favorite host. Really, any of us. We just want to get those likes, but it helps us get seen by more people, helps us reach more people, and hopefully save people some money along long term with giving just the process here we talk about a lot. So hit that like button on all your favorite Awesemo shows. But the top 3 owned plays on DraftKings: DeMarcus Cousins projected for 86% ownership, John Wall projected for 59%, and Bradley Beal projected for 44%. And Greg, I am above the field on Cousins. I'm above the field on Wall, with the field on Beal. If you had to choose one guy to be under on of these 3 guys, who would it be?
I'm going to say it's Beal, and it's not because I don't like Beal as a play. It's just because I think the other guys are that much stronger of plays.
Okay. And on FanDuel, top 3 on there: DeMarcus Cousins, number 1 at 55%, John Wall also at 55%, and Bradley Beal at number 3 at 52%. So Greg, on FanDuel, which of these 3 would you want to fade?
Just none of them. I'm playing all of them a lot. I'm not going to tell anybody to not play guys who I'm playing a lot of.
There we go. So those are the top 3 owned plays. Clearly a very, 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 very filled night for DeMarcus Cousins, John Wall, and Bradley Beal. I'm terrified to be left holding the John Wall bag. I'm really hoping that this is one time where it's just like our ownership algorithm makes it look like John Wall. Everybody's going to be playing him, and instead people will just talk themselves out of it, because I'm going to be 70% John Wall on DraftKings.
So I do think there's one, and by the way, I love John Wall tonight, but at least if we talk about a guy who's one of the high-priced players that is not getting as much ownership, it's Trae Young. I think he's going under-owned, and it goes back to what I said before, how I also think he's being a little bit under-projected. Maybe that'll change now that we have the Russell Westbrook news, but I mean, when we started the show, Russell Westbrook was projected for twice as much ownership on FanDuel as Trae Young. And to me, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we consider some of the minutes restriction issues. And then also that the matchup for Trae Young is not nearly as difficult as it appears on paper. If that's actually going to be the case, and I'll have to bring up the latest ownership. Do you have it in front of you right now?
I do. Let me actually make sure it is the latest, because I think it was 8 minutes ago. So just want to make sure we get the best. Yeah, I do.
So what is on FanDuel? What's the difference in ownership between Russell Westbrook and Trae Young?
Russell Westbrook in our most recent run projected for 25, and Trae projected for 25 as well.
So considering the minutes restriction we now have on Russell Westbrook, that makes no sense to me. Like, these 2 guys are projected for the same exact amount of ownership, and we have Trae Young playing against the depleted Clippers team, and Russell Westbrook is playing like 28 minutes, 27 minutes, something like that. That just seems way off to me, especially because Trae Young has generally been a little bit better this year in terms of a fantasy player. He's also cheaper than Westbrook by a decent amount on DK, if we're talking about over there. So overall, I think Trae Young, if you're looking at the high tier and you're trying to say like, hey, I like Bradley Beal, I like John Wall, but how do I differentiate myself a little bit? It would be with Trae Young. And that's not to say that he's a massively contrarian play. It's a 3-game slate. You're not going to find some stud who's 5% owned or something like that. But at least relative to the ownership, I think Trae Young is one of the stronger plays up top.
So this short slate, Greg, getting us on the same page better than usual. I'm going to be double the field on Trae Young. I think just, the price point too, the fact that people are going to be paying a lot for the Clippers and their elevated price points on DraftKings, on FanDuel, not quite the same situation, but on DraftKings, like, you're paying, what is it, $6,800 for Reggie Jackson. You're paying $5,800 for Lou Williams, which I think the latter is a little more justifiable. Luke Kennard is still $6K, even though I think he's still a very viable play. Like, I think he actually projects pretty well and is one of the guys I'm more comfortable with. Marcus Morris, we talked about earlier, his price isn't quite as bad, but still, like, these guys are priced up. Like, Reggie Jackson is priced up higher than I think he ever was on Detroit, and barring maybe some really hot run. And that was his team. Like, that was a team that they paid a lot of money to him, and he just never got there. So I think there's some real reason to go to Trae Young, just in the hopes that maybe Reggie Jackson ends up double-digit ownership, and then you have Trae Young, who his floor is probably, Reggie Jackson's best case scenario tonight.
So somebody we haven't talked about yet. I agree with you on Reggie Jackson, by the way. He's 5,000 on FanDuel, so it's a little bit of a different situation, but 6,000 on DK, it's just a fair price to me. There's other better values on the slate. Somebody who's, I think, a reasonable pivot off of Reggie Jackson, but I have no clue what to make of his playing time or his production as a whole. We talked about him before very briefly, just in passing, in a joke. Lou Williams, right? Like, what do we actually make of Lou Williams on the slate? He's had a very underwhelming season. And there's been times where we've seen Paul George and Kawhi Leonard be out, and Lou Williams has moved into the starting lineup, had big games. He's been just terrible this year. The minutes aren't there. When he's been on the court, he hasn't played well. The usage is down. So what do you expect from Lou Williams tonight? I have no feel for him at all, but I don't want to fade him either.
So I'm going to be over on Lou Williams based on our most recent run. We have him just under 15% on DraftKings. And, for me, I think getting a little bit above is where I wanted to go. I'm going to have him at 22%. So not any like gigantic take or anything. Lou has been terrible this year. I think it's really hard to argue it, but a lot of that comes down to the fact his role seems to have changed a bit. He doesn't have his pick and roll buddy in Montrezl Harrell. I think that's been a bit of a factor where Zubac hasn't been quite able to fill that as much. And Lou, the one thing that I think you could point to for him that you'd expect to get better, 50% true shooting on the year. And, he's normally been a 54% guy over the last year and change. And that includes this downturn. Also, just overall, he just one of those guys that screams to me like it's going to get better at some point coming soon. So I think that's the logic there, as well as the fact that he's just at a reasonable price. Like I would much rather have Lou at 5,800 on DraftKings than Reggie Jackson at 6,800, even if Reggie's starting. Like Lou being in that second unit, it's basically just going to be him and Morris putting up shots.
Yeah, I have 15% Lou Williams right now, and it was the same for me. It was like, all right, I think I know there's upside with Lou Williams, but the downside is apparent also, and I think that there's no player on the slate with a wider range of outcomes than Lou Williams.
Also, one fun fact about Lou Williams, which, past performance not indicative of future success, but maybe if it gives you a little more confidence in Lou Williams. Greg, do you want to guess how many games Lou Williams has been under 30 fantasy points versus Atlanta since 2015?
That's that. I mean, I can't even figure out how many games it would. All right, so you're only asking me if it's going to be a really low number. So I'm going to say 2.
One game under 30 fantasy points. It was 2015, December 4th. He put up 27.25 fantasy points, 27.25, shot 6 for 13. Every other game, he's been above that mark. He's also been above 45 times out of this stretch here. And it's, let's see, how many games is this? 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 10 games, a 10-game stretch since 2015. There are revenge narratives are things sometimes. And, so is a man's love for chicken wings and other.
He just gets comfortable while he's there. He's really in his atmosphere.
But, it did jump out to me. That's, it's very different Atlanta teams. It's not the same team and all that. That's why you normally don't really care. Like if anybody tells you like, oh, the Bills are 19-1 against the spread over the last 10 years. Like it doesn't matter. It really matters as a team of the last few years. But I do think that Lou Williams having that track record, I think still a viable reason to at least give him a little bit of a bump there if you were, unsure of him. But really it's the opportunity more than anything. Just so many guys missing. You don't have a Kawhi Leonard, when you don't have a Paul George. Somebody's got to do something there. And I think the deeper dive guys also pointed out too, Lou, a lead ball handler who can get his own shot. And that is sort of worth its weight in gold on a slate like this, where, the Clippers don't really have anybody who can do that for themselves. We got a super chat here, and here's the fun tier of guys. J Love 300 asking, would y'all start Solomon Hill or Anthony Gill? So, Greg, this is two guys, similar names, similar usage rates. Who would you want out of Solomon Hill or Anthony Gill?
Yeah, I mean, well, say what you will. Both these guys are not going to be good, but at least for my lineups, the answer is Anthony Gill. I have Anthony Gill, and I assume this is a DraftKings question, right?
I would have to assume. He didn't specify, but yeah.
All right, so yeah, I have Anthony Gill in more lineups than Solomon Hill. I don't have 0 Solomon Hill, but I'm a little more invested in my new soulmate Anthony Gill.
I actually just realized now here's the thing. I based my crunches usually on target score. I didn't have Anthony Gill getting to where he needs to target score wise, but because what Greg talked about earlier, the minimum salary part, I am now going to be slightly above the field on Anthony Gill.
Yeah, it's impossible. It's impossible not to, because like I said before, I assume that you're like me too. When you ran your lineups before the show, you probably had a decent amount of Jerome Robinson for similar reasons as Anthony Gill, just because of the price point. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that was what it was. It's really that he's minimum salary and that he's not owned enough, I guess, for what it should be. I haven't projected for my projections that I run 12.7 fantasy points, and that's still enough to get him in that much.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I said too. I said I have him around 14, and he still ends up in a significant portion of my lineups on DK just because I needed to save that salary somewhere. So the first time I ran the lineups, like I was saying before, and it was before I'd taken down Jerome Robinson's projection. So I was looking, I was like, oh, I'm still not getting to Anthony Gill. And then I realized like, oh no, I still have a bunch of Jerome Robinson. I have to nerf his projection because I hadn't done that yet. And I did that. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, now Anthony Gill is popping up in a bunch of my lineups because I have to save the salary somewhere. And I mean, who else are you rostering for cheap? Like we just got a question, Solomon Hill or Anthony Gill. And when those are the comparisons, then yeah, Gill kind of makes some sense.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of slate it is today, where you get some Anthony Gill and you don't ask questions. Ben P asking, what do you guys have Westbrook projected for? Site still has him. I think this must have been before the update. Site still has him for 40 plus fantasy points. That can't be right at 20 minutes. I actually didn't put in the minutes change for Westbrook, but I can do that now. Do you have a projection for Westbrook with his new expected minutes load?
So I have him a little under 41 fantasy points, and that gets me to and it's about the same on DraftKings and FanDuel, like a little over 40. On FanDuel, that got me to 3% Westbrook, and that got me to 0% of him on DK.
Yeah, I don't think I have any Westbrook either. Awesemo still has him a little bit above 40 for the 28 minutes that he's projected for. And for me, I have him a little bit under. I have him at 37.5 for 28 minutes of run. So, I'm not getting there on DK, but if it's a 3-game slate, if you want to go crazy and hope that Westbrook somehow is great in that time frame, go for it. Let's see, any other questions in the Slack? How do we feel about Danilo Gallinari as a DK GPP dart? Not a play for me, I think. I really find it hard to believe that the minutes are going to be there in a meaningful way. He doesn't project well for me at that price point, with Awesemo having him at 17 minutes. So Gallo, not a guy for me, Greg, but how about you?
I don't have him on DK. I have more lineups on FanDuel, and I'm still not sure if I have him there. Let's see. I have Danilo Gallinari at 0% on both sites. So no real interest in Gallo for me. So here's the issue, though, also with Gallo, is he hasn't played much this year, and he also has a pretty long injury history, dealing with an ankle injury. And he did come back last game, and he's been back 2 games now, and he played fairly well from a fantasy perspective last game. He scored, it was 24 fantasy points, but he only played 19 minutes. So just in 19 minutes, yeah, he could do something like he did last game and just hit a bunch of his shots and ended up scoring like 24, 25 fantasy points. But that's kind of his ceiling at his price point right now, it seems, unless there's some unforeseen thing where all of a sudden Gallo's going to play, like 28 minutes or something like that. I don't think that's going to be the case given his really restricted minutes in his first 2 games coming back. And that's really going to cap his ceiling, because it's not like he's mid-price or anything.
One guy who we didn't really hit on from the Clippers, we're getting some questions about Terrence Mann. People talking about having 100% Terrence Mann. He is starting. Awesemo has him getting 26 minutes. And Greg, despite the 26 minutes, I don't get any Terrence Mann. I didn't actually. Let me double check that in this most recent crunch, because I think I might be speaking a little bit out of turn, but let's see. Yeah, did not get any Terrence Mann. I actually got one lineup, my bad. One lineup of Terrence Mann here out of my 50 or so. Greg, how are you handling Terrence Mann? What did you get for him? Because I feel like the price point on DK, like, this is going to sound terrible, and clip this one if you want to be mean to me after the fact, but I'd rather have Anthony Gill than Terrence Mann based on their prices.
All right, so there's 2 different situations we have to talk about, because when people are saying they're all in on Terrence Mann, they're probably talking about FanDuel, where he's mid-price. Okay. So it's wildly different scenarios. I agree. DraftKings, I don't have Terrence Mann. I do have Anthony Gill, who I have not been able to stop talking about for the last 30 minutes now. So Anthony Gill, I do think is a better play on DraftKings. FanDuel, I think that Terrence Mann is a better play just because he's mid-price.
Yeah, I mean, 4,400 for Terrence Mann is really the issue. I agree. Like, if he were 3K, like, I would actually think he's a better play than Gill by a decent margin, because I have Mann for 17 fantasy points, and like, I think that's Awesemo has him for 22, so he's even more bullish on him. But at 4,400 on DK, like, I don't think you're saving enough to go there, and I think there's enough mid-price guys to get to. One game that we really haven't hit on at all that we have to. It's ugly on paper. It is a game with an 11-point spread. It's the last game on the slate, so late night hammer, all that. But New York and Utah, not something I think I got a lot of besides Alec Burks. I got a good amount of Alec Burks, and there's a real revenge game for you guys for all your deep cut revenge game narratives. Alec Burks coming back to Utah, a team who sacrificed him to the scrap heap. And to me, he's the only guy I have with even a decent projection on in this entire game. But Greg, do you have anything at all of interest here in New York and Utah, given that it is a game that's mostly overlooked ownership wise?
So in terms of building lineups that could be a blowout, I have some exposure to Obi Toppin on DK. He's 3,100. We haven't seen a ton of him this year, but from what we've seen of him in the regular season and preseason, it seems like he's going to be a pretty decent fantasy producer on a points per minute basis. And the spread for this game is 11.5. And even though I never think that games are, totally likely, or that we could say is a lock to be a blowout, if one of these games is a blowout tonight, Jazz Knicks is certainly the most likely. And I think that it makes sense to get some exposure to Obi Toppin if you're playing multiple lineups, just in case that does happen. Because also, like we talked about before, the value situation is so crappy on the slate that we're talking ourselves into Anthony Gill. So if we can talk ourselves into Anthony Gill, why can't we talk ourselves into the Jazz just smashing the Knicks and Obi Toppin playing a lot of the fourth quarter? So I think that he makes sense in that kind of scenario. Other Knicks, I'm with you. I actually wrote up Alec Burks on the site today. We do a syllabus for everybody. We write up contrarian plays. Alec Burks was my contrarian play I wrote up for the day. I think that with him now moving into the starting lineup, somebody who takes a lot of shots when he's on the court, he's always been a high usage guy when he's out there. I think that he makes sense for that reason. I have him right around, let's see, I have 18% exposure to Alec Burks. So he is the guy that I like the most from the Knicks, at least on FanDuel. I think Julius Randle makes sense just because, like, who else are we rostering at power forward? Especially now that Marcus Morris isn't starting. If you don't want to be like 100% Marcus Morris, you have to roster somebody else. And Julius Randle is one of the guys that makes sense.
Yeah, Randall, I think the DK price was a little bit harder for me, especially because Topin's back in the mix. I think the deeper dive guys are not to always reference them, but it's a great show that comes on right before us. And I feel like sometimes they make the points even better than we possibly could on this show. So give them all the credit in the world, and make sure you watch that show before Lock. If for some reason you're always just tuning into this one. But they were talking about Topin and how, maybe he sort of just cramps Randall's minutes enough to be viable for him. And then also to really hurt the ceiling for Randall, who's been playing just such an ungodly amount of minutes as any Tom Thibodeau star player or key player might play. But I agree. Like, I think that Topin to me, like, honestly, probably should be considered a little bit more not exciting, but we are talking about Anthony Gill. Like, I don't hate the idea of going there at 3,100. Like, I think Topin has a better chance to hit his target score. I think obviously just that extra $100 can still open up enough to justify going to an Anthony Gill, but it's not a crazy idea at all, because Utah's a legitimately good team. Like, New York plays slow and has been playing better defense this year, but Utah's the best version of what New York does, is they actually hit their shots and have guys who can, get space and create for other people. So I do think there's a chance here that Utah, we don't project blowouts. We try our best not to do that, but 86% implied probability for Utah to win today. Gigantic money line favoring them. Maybe this is one time on a 3-game slate where it's not crazy to have a blowout build.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing too is, so while you can't necessarily predict a blowout, I think you can look at the game and you can say, what is the percentage chance that is going to be a blowout? Because that's not going to be 0% either. Maybe you look at the spread. And this is actually something I'd probably like to do a little bit more research into, but I think it makes sense to look at that game and just say, hey, there's a 14% chance that the game's a blowout. And I think that's probably something like a reasonable number. And then you say, all right, based on that, I think Obi Toppin gets extended minutes in that sort of situation. Then I'd say, like, okay, based on that, I think Obi Toppin has a decent game in a small percentage of those blowouts. And therefore I'd say, like, hey, I'm willing to go like 8% Obi Toppin.
If you're an Awesemo Plus member, we did just get an ownership update a couple minutes ago, so go check that out in case you need it for your final prep here. We got about 11 minutes left to lock, probably 10 by the time you guys hear this. So again, hit that like button for us, help us out a bunch. If you have any questions, start to get them in here. We'll take a few here down the home stretch. And if you enjoyed this show today, enjoyed the timing of the slate as well, with the extra 30 minutes here past our usual lock time of 7 p.m. Eastern. Tune in tomorrow. We're doing a Super Draft exclusive show to celebrate some gigantic tournaments over there. Super Draft back in here as a sponsor, not sponsoring this show specifically, but tomorrow it's going to be a lot of Super Draft here. And if for some reason you are playing on Super Draft today, which you should be, it's a really great site to be playing on because you can pick any players you want there. It's all about the multiplier format. Some top plays on Super Draft today, just gratis, because we care so much about you guys. DeMarcus Cousins, a 1.5x multiplier, looks like the top play according to Awesemo's projections. Victor Oladipo not far behind. Trae Young also in the top 3 there, 1.25x multiplier for him. And Reggie Jackson, a much more meaningful player, much more reasonable play rather, on Super Draft, a 1.9x multiplier. So play him on there, maybe play him a little bit on FanDuel. Don't play Reggie Jackson too much on DraftKings would be my approach. And until he goes for 50 fantasy points today and spits in my face, this is always the case. Question from J-Dub here in the premium Slack asking Gill and Victor Oladipo or Alec Burks and Kennard for a DK GPP. Despite my love for Anthony Gill, for me, that would be Burks and Kennard. But Greg, what do you want?
It is Gill and Depot for me, mostly because I don't like the price point on Luke Kennard on DraftKings. That's a really expensive price for him. I don't have none of him, except I don't want to have a ridiculous amount of a chalky Luke Kennard at 6,000.
Also, somebody posted K-Dub in the premium Slack posted Anthony Gill's headshot, and I feel like he looks like a nice fellow. He doesn't look like a great basketball player, but great smile. I'll say that. The smile matrix for any old school On the Contrary fans in our days with Evan Silva may remember that sometimes you just enjoy a player's smile and upgrade their projection as a result.
He looks different than I expected him to. I'm not going to pretend I knew what Anthony Gill looked like before now. But this is also not what I expected him to look like. It's not going to change my exposure to him. But I will say that if he has a bad game, I'm going to look at this picture and be like, I should have known.
R. Cathalza in the chat asking, is it possible Morris doesn't play? There's no reason to think that'd be the case, especially on a night where they're short on bodies. If anything, I think they might just be putting him in the second unit group to make sure that he gets going. And then they're probably, I mean, I'm not saying probably, but decent chance here. They want to get him going in that second unit and then, hopefully keep that going to play a good amount of minutes. But Greg, you don't have any reason to expect Morris not to play, right? I feel like this is just a question we're taking to fill the last 10 minutes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope he doesn't play. If I had an expectation he wasn't going to play, I'd definitely lower his ownership. I have him 40% right now. And I still think that he's one of the stronger plays, particularly on the Clippers. And then on FanDuel, you just look at the other power forward options, and it's Julius Randle, John Collins, Serge Ibaka, Marcus Morris, and you all the way down to PJ Tucker. So the options dry up pretty quickly. I find them very difficult to get away from. So I think that there's reason to think he doesn't play over 30 minutes. 0 minutes, I would be shocked if that happens.
Yeah, actually ended up coming down on Marcus Morris with my sorting and going up on Luke Kennard. I think Luke Kennard looks a bit under-owned with our most recent run of ownership. So I'm going to have more Kennard by a good margin than Morris. But I like coming off the bench, I don't really have any issue. And I wish I had actually, now that I'm thinking about it, separated my Marcus Morris from my Lou Williams just so to try to capture whoever's going to be that guy who goes off in the second unit. But I do think that it's still in play for me for sure, but I'm going to be under the field now on Morris and still over on Lou by a little bit.
So we know the start, just in the interest of killing time here, we know what the starting lineup is for the Clippers. Who do you think they close with, though? Are they going to close with the starters? Like, is Terrence Mann going to be out there for the final stretch of the game? I tend to think not. I still think Marcus Morris and Lou Williams have a good chance to close the game.
So there's a chance they're playing Mann for his defense, and it's not like he's an amazing lockdown defender, and nobody is ever a defender you should really worry about, seriously for the most part because of how the NBA is. We talk about that a lot on here. So it wouldn't shock me, I guess, if you got to the closing group, but in my mind, it should be Lou and Reggie closing, I would think, in the backcourt, and then Morris, Ibaka, and then Kennard would be what I would imagine for a 5.
Yeah, I think the question mark to me would be, do they close with between Lou Williams, Kennard, and Reggie Jackson? I think probably 2 of the 3 of them are going to be on the court in the final stretch, and I'm not sure which it's going to be. But the starting lineup, it definitely lowered my minutes on Marcus Morris, but not to the point where I freaked out and was like, oh, he's not going to play. It was somebody who was like, all right, I went from like 60% Marcus Morris to 40%.
Yeah, I think that's fair. No, and I think, the closing part is often the important part of the equation. So I probably shouldn't be as low on Morris. It just was sort of how it worked out with my sorting process. So I'm trying to trust the process, trying to, embrace my Philadelphia 76ers side and truly TTP. But still Morris, I think, a perfectly viable play, at least as viable as Anthony Gill. I think we could agree on that. Yeah,
I mean, Anthony Gill, by the way, what's going to be really funny is when Anthony Gill actually smashes and we could just pretend we knew it was coming, even though we've made fun of this is really the best place to be, actually, because we've made fun of him as a bad play while also saying that we're rostering him. So there's kind of a win-win built in here, right? Because even as a bad game, it's like, well, we kind of knew this was coming, or he actually crushes and it's like, hey, look, we've got him in our lineups.
J-Dub asking, any interest in Nwaba in the premium Slack? I didn't get him, and honestly, I'm not inclined to get a lot of these guys on Houston besides Cousins and Wall. And I know Greg is a little more optimistic for Oladipo, but I think Oladipo's price for not having Wall in there, for having this 35-ish% usage rate he's had so far in Houston, I just think it comes down enough where I don't want to get there. I'm not really getting any other guys. Actually, got PJ Tucker, a stupid amount more than I'm comfortable with. But besides that, apparently, always fun when you learn these things as you're talking and making a point. You learn you have 18% PJ Tucker. But how are you feeling about, I guess, the Rockets and in particular Nwaba? But give me your thoughts one more time on the Rockets as a team.
So Nwaba individually, I have him in 1 lineup on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I have him in 0 lineups. So there we go. There's my David Nwaba. He ended up in 1 lineup, and I'm sure it was just because the optimer was like, hey, he fits in this one spot here, therefore he's in the lineup. But definitely not somebody that I'd recommend, or somebody that I'm looking and going like, oh, I wish I had more Nwaba. He's in 1 lineup, and if I had to update, I'd probably take him out of that 1 lineup.
One guy we didn't hit on, and I don't think we know enough about, but I feel like we should need to talk about because somebody I think is fake news in the chat, or maybe earlier than some of the other reporting. But Kevin Porter Jr. for the Rockets, maybe potentially making his debut. Now this is getting spammed in the chat, and now I'm really questioning that it's actually a real thing. But Kevin Porter, this guy's saying he's starting. We don't know that, so don't rush to anger right now. We'll confirm it if we get it, if that is a thing that's happening. But do you have any interest at all in Kevin Porter? Do you think he even plays meaningful enough minutes to be a consideration? Because I know people will remember the Cleveland days and some of the highlights, and hopefully not the way he went out and throwing tantrums. But do you have any Kevin Porter thoughts at all?
I'm looking on Twitter really quick just to see if I could find any news on him, because that would be probably more accurate than just looking at whatever somebody who probably doesn't have a profile picture is saying in whatever chat he's in.
Yeah, I don't see anything at all about that. So that's why we ask for no fake news, guys. And for all the people who always wonder why we take a second to confirm things, yeah, that's timed out by El Negro Loco. So no news on that. And this is what happens when you try to trust people, when you open your heart and then you get burned by Kevin Porter.
Yeah, but the cool thing is that if we do find out that he's starting, which would be totally unrelated to whatever this guy's saying, it would just happen to be something that's totally happenstance, then I'm sure we could get angry messages about it on Twitter later, which would also be nice. As of now, I have Kevin Porter playing 0 minutes. I'll make an adjustment if we find out that to be not the case later in the day.
Lucis Smoke saying they said he wasn't playing for a while. I had just seen some stuff about him not being on the injury report, maybe that he still had a chance to get in, but I don't have him as getting any minutes either. So I just want to cover it because I know he's a guy people are questioning. And if you want to get him for cheap on your top shots, now's the time to really stock up on the Kevin Porter digital collection.
Oh, look at you throwing in top shots, trying to be cool. Look at Spags; he's all hip with his money hat and his top shots references.
Look, I feel like I'm somebody not participating in it at all. I feel like I know more than enough about it. That's really the main thing I think about his about top shots.
If you're on Twitter at any point ever, you've heard about it. Like there's no way to avoid the latest top shots news, because I don't know anything about it. And if people just tweet about stuff with no context, I just assume that it's about Top Shots. So people are just like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. It's like, oh, something happened with Top Shots. That's the only thing people are referencing right now.
Here's a nice little chat. Georgios T88 saying, thank you guys. Great bets come out of your insight. So there we go. That's why we make sure to not tell you Kevin Porter is starting and want to double check everything. But get yelled at by YouTube when we miss a guy, but like when it happens a split second before, it's been through our usual Twitter and all that. And then sometimes it's the other way where it's like just somebody blatantly lying. And that's the two-sided coin, the duality of it all. Let's see. What about Jayshawn Tate? Nutty Professor is asking on FanDuel. I actually had a little bit before of him on DK, and I don't think I'm getting there quite as much. Actually, I have a little bit still on DK just because of the price point. But Greg, did you get any Jayshawn Tate on your FanDuel lineups?
Yeah, and I have him, even with him projected for 19 fantasy points, I still have him in nearly a third of my lineups on FanDuel, just because we look at some of the other options, like Garrison Matthews rates out as a good play. Like I said, RJ Barrett is a chalk play on FanDuel at 7,500 in Utah. That's how weak the small forward options are. So Jayshawn Tate, I assume that he's going to play significant minutes again. The only thing that would make me change that actually now is if we get some sort of like Kevin Porter Jr. news. As long as that's not the case, then yeah, I think Tate's probably going to have to play somewhere in the neighborhood of 25-ish minutes or something like that. And as long as that's the case, if he scores 18 to 20 fantasy points, he's a pretty good chance of landing in the optimal because of how weak the small forward pool is on FanDuel.
All right. And any last minute questions here? Here's one. Dylan Moon asking nicely, so we'll do it. Lou Will and Bonga or Burks and Morris? For me, that'd be Burks and Morris. No site given though, Greg.
Yeah, Burks and Morris.
All right. And we are just about locked. So anything you want to say, Greg, before we call it quits? I feel like by the time I finish this, now we're locked. Anything you want to say? Any plugs you want to give, Greg?
No, I think just follow me on Twitter at Ehrenberg DFS. Follow Spags on Twitter. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like we said earlier, we were almost at 50,000 subscribers. If we get to that number by the Super Bowl, it'll make us all very happy. So that's really the reason that you should do it. Make us happy and also make yourself happy, because then you get access to all the latest content and all the YouTube videos we do just as they go live. So subscribe to us. Help us get to 50,000 subscribers on YouTube.
And the Lance Company, how about an Anthony Gill top shot? It's going to be him standing there trying to box somebody out and giving up a rebound. It's
going to be him in a 3-point stance in the corner, waiting for the ball that doesn't come to him.
Clapping for Bradley Beal as he does something. We'll be back soon, guys. Tomorrow, it's me and you again tomorrow, right? We're running it back.
Probably.
Yeah, I think it's me and Greg again tomorrow. Tune in then. I think we got a late slate live before lock as well. We got the Super Draft show, lots of NBA content coming up tomorrow in addition to the strategy show, all the other stuff you'd like on the YouTube channel. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. We'll be back with you guys again very soon. So enjoy your nights and good luck. Anthony Gill. I thought he was gonna look like Kendall Gill, the old Nets player. I was hoping that was
I almost called him Kendall Gill like 3 times.
I loved Kendall Gill when I was a kid.